Agricultural repair meant survival, and survival meant loyalty. By rebuilding the countryside, the Qing transformed themselves into protectors rather than destroyers. This cultural and administrative blending created a foundation for long-term rule, but another challenge remained: securing and expanding empire territory in an age of global change. Part 3 explains how the Qing constructed one of the largest land empires in Chinese history through diplomacy and military conquest. The early Qing period represents one of the most dramatic expansions of territorial control in Asian history. Yet this achievement required more than brute force. It demanded negotiation, cultural diplomacy, and pragmatic flexibility. While the Ming had struggled to control distant frontier zones, the Qing developed a sophisticated political system that integrated border peoples rather than merely conquering them. Their first challenge lay in Manchuria itself. The Manchus needed to preserve ancestral homelands while ruling China from Beijing. To achieve this, they declared Manchuria a protected region closed to Chinese immigration. Hunting grounds, ancestral tombs, and banner farms remained exclusively Manchu. This policy helped maintain ethnic cohesion and military readiness while limiting assimilation pressures. Beyond Manchuria, the Qing moved to secure Inner Mongolia. Unlike earlier dynasties that saw Mongols as uncontrollable enemies, the Qing forged alliances through marriage, banner incorporation, and shared steppe traditions. Mongol chieftains received titles, land, and government positions, creating bonds of loyalty. By treating Mongols as political partners rather than conquered foes, the Qing neutralized one of the greatest historical threats to Chinese dynasties. The Qing also pushed westward. They began forging relationships with Muslim communities in Xinjiang through diplomacy and military show. At the same time, the imperial state faced new diplomatic realities. Western merchants had begun arriving in major numbers during the 18th century, with British, Portuguese, French, and American ships crowding Canton Harbor. The Qing Canton system, which concentrated all foreign trade in a single city and restricted communication through official guilds, seemed effective during Qianlong's early reign. It offered enormous revenue and allowed the state to maintain strict control. But the system blinded China from understanding the scope of expanding global markets. European economies were industrializing. Naval technology, manufacturing output, global finance, and colonial systems all moved into revolutionary acceleration. Chinese elites, convinced of their cultural superiority, viewed European advances as trivial. There was almost no awareness that Western firepower, steam engines, and capitalist networks would reshape the world. Domestically, intellectual culture reacted to demographic stress with nostalgia, not innovation. Scholars turned toward ancient texts, searching for moral clarity in Confucian classics. The evidential research movement emphasized philology, textual analysis, and historical accuracy. This scholarly development produced great learning, but did not inspire economic or scientific transformation. By 1800, China remained enormous, culturally unified, and seemingly powerful, but the structural unity masked fragility. Internal governing tools had not evolved to meet new demographic, economic, or international realities. The next phase of Qing history would expose these cracks brutally. Entering the early 19th century, the Qing Empire stood at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. Yet, unlike Japan, which would later respond to Western encroachment with strategic modernization, the Qing approached change with hesitation and disbelief. They were not blind, they were proud. The memory of conquering China, unifying Tibet and Xinjiang, and defeating European colonial forces in Taiwan fostered confidence that China remained unchallengeable. This worldview obscured emerging dangers. Western nations no longer traveled to Asia simply as traders. They saw trade dominance, markets, and imperial influence. Britain in particular had built a global empire powered by industrial manufacturing. British merchants desperately wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, goods that Europeans could not produce themselves. But Qing restrictions limited trade to Canton and required payment in silver. Britain's trade deficit was enormous. Silver drained westward, destabilizing British currency. To reverse this imbalance, British merchants sought goods to sell in China. Tea could not be sold because China grew its own. Finished textiles faced little demand because Chinese silk remained preferred. But opium, grown in British India, became their economic solution. By the early 19th century, illegal opium imports surged. The Qing state recognized the danger. Opium addiction spread among peasants, scholars, soldiers, and officials. Millions became dependent. Productivity dropped. Criminal networks flourished. But the Qing response was disorganized. Some officials accepted bribes to ignore the trade. Others demanded harsher punishment. The central state, weakened by fiscal shortages and bureaucratic disunity, struggled to enforce bans. Meanwhile, the maritime world was shifting. European naval technology had advanced far beyond anything in East Asia. While Chinese junks relied on wind and traditional hull designs, British warships operated with advanced cannon systems and increasingly powerful steam engines. Global capitalism made trade not just profitable, but geopolitically necessary. Britain did not view trade restrictions merely as insult. They viewed them as barriers to national survival. Inside China, many elites underestimated these changes. They believed foreign interest in trade was merely greed, not strategic imperial ambition. The tributary worldview, which assumed that China held cultural supremacy over outsiders, made it difficult to conceive that foreign nations might possess technology capable of military superiority. Officials often dismissed foreign machines as novelties. Even those who recognized their power lacked access to national decision-making authority. At the same time, society continued fracturing from within. Famine and floods ravaged northern provinces, especially along the Yellow River. Local officials pleaded for assistance, but imperial coffers were nearly empty. Corruption, though reduced under the Jiaqing emperor after Hushin's execution, remained widespread. Secret societies, including triads and heaven and earth associations, expanded their networks. Some groups posed themselves as defenders of justice. Others simply existed to survive economic collapse. The Jiaqing emperor attempted reform. He punished corrupt officials, cracked down on White Lotus remnants, reduced court extravagance, and ordered stricter governance. But Jiaqing lacked his grandfather Kangxi's aura, his father Yongzheng's efficiency, and Qianlong's early charisma. The bureaucracy had grown too large and too interconnected for one emperor to discipline effectively. The state no longer commanded unquestioned loyalty. Instead, power leaked into local clan authorities, militia captains, merchant guilds, and secret brotherhoods. Meanwhile, Western missionaries continued arriving, although still restricted. They brought scientific knowledge, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, but Qing officials often rejected these teachings because they did not fit classical ideology. China continued developing scholarly arts, but the scientific revolution transforming Europe bypassed the empire completely. This historical layering explains why studying the Ming-Qing transition is crucial. It reveals that Chinese civilization depends on adaptation, continuity, and synthesis, not linear replacement. It also reveals why China today emphasizes unity, strong central government, and national rejuvenation. Leadership sees the Ming and Qing collapses not only as historical events, but as warnings. To understand why the Ming Dynasty collapsed, and the Qing Dynasty eventually followed the same fate centuries later, we must examine not only military, political, or economic reasons, but also cultural and psychological ones. Dynasties are shaped by ideas, emotions, public belief, and collective confidence. Societies collapse not only when armies are defeated, but when people cease to believe their system deserves to continue. In the later Ming period, culture itself began to fracture, producing brilliance in art and literature, but also exhaustion, cynicism, and detachment that mirrored political decline. The Ming was, in many ways, a culturally sophisticated empire. Cities like Nanjing, Suzhou, and Beijing became hubs of painting, porcelain production, philosophy, music, and theater. The Jiangnan region produced vast literary output. The novel as a genre flourished, leading to creations like Journey to the West and The Plum in the Golden Vase. Yet this cultural flowering happened alongside bureaucratic suffocation. The examination system demanded enormous intellectual energy, but rewarded memorization over creativity. Men studied the same Confucian texts for generations, competing endlessly for limited scholar-official positions. This produced anxiety, family pressure, and intellectual stagnation. By the late Ming, the psychological weight of bureaucracy became unbearable. Men who failed examinations faced lifelong stigma. Those who passed often fell into administrative environments filled with corruption, bribery, and factional warfare. The gap between China and the outside world widened, yet few recognized it. The empire still believed itself invincible. But this illusion would be shattered within decades, as Britain forced military confrontation over opium trade rights. The early 19th century represented a moment when the Qing dynasty's internal instability collided with growing international pressure. What emerged from this collision was the Opium War, a conflict that permanently altered China's trajectory and exposed the structural weaknesses that had been developing for generations. To understand why opium became the catalyst for war, one must examine market realities, imperial attitudes, cultural worldviews, and the ways corruption deeply shaped Qing governance. Britain's desire to correct its trade imbalance drove illegal opium traffic. China's refusal to open ports shaped military escalation. Both sides entered conflict not because either sought war, but because their worldviews were incompatible and because neither believed the other could seriously threaten them. Britain's economic motivations were straightforward. By the early 1800s, Britain imported vast quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, yet China imported almost nothing from Britain. Tea alone became a national necessity in England. Demand skyrocketed, but the Qing government required silver payments, draining British reserves and threatening currency stability. Britain's solution was opium grown in India and smuggled into China. At first, opium entered through secret channels. Small boats, hidden coves, bribed customs officers, and collusion between merchants and corrupted local officials. Yet within decades, illegal opium transformed into an enormous economic pipeline. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese citizens smoked opium. Addiction was not limited to the lower classes. Scholar officials used opium to relax after examinations. Soldiers smoked to numb boredom on garrison duty. Government secretaries used it to work through long nights. Even some palace attendants consumed opium. The Qing court recognized the crisis. Opium addiction drained productivity, emptied government silver reserves, and destabilized financial systems. Silver left China in exchange for opium, reversing the once profitable tea trade. Prices rose. Tax burdens deepened. Peasants suffered most. Many lost farmland while trying to pay silver fees. Officials debated policy fiercely. Some argued for legalizing opium and taxing it to weaken smugglers. Others insisted that legalization would destroy moral values. The most famous anti-opium advocate was Li Zicheng, a scholar official known for integrity and strategic brilliance. Lin was appointed imperial commissioner in 1839 and sent to Canton to eradicate the drug trade. Lin approached the crisis with a combination of moral conviction and administrative control. He arrested Chinese dealers, destroyed pipes, seized opium stocks, and demanded foreign participation in prohibition enforcement. Lin's most symbolic act came when he confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium and ordered them destroyed at Human Beach. The drug was flushed and neutralized with salt, lime, and water, an event that shook British merchants and humiliated the British crown. Britain demanded compensation, arguing confiscation represented theft of private property. The Qing court responded that illegal merchandise had no legal status. Neither side saw compromise as honoring national dignity. Britain requested open negotiations. The Qing refused. Diplomacy collapsed. By late 1839, conflict moved toward armed confrontation. Britain dispatched modern warships to the Pearl River, launching attacks on coastal fortifications. The Imperial Navy, still operating with outdated sailing ships and cannons, could not match British technology. Steam-powered vessels maneuvered with precision. Artillery range exceeded anything in Qing arsenals, and naval tactics were decades ahead of Chinese knowledge. By 1840, British forces blockaded the Yangtze, threatening to cut grain supplies to Beijing. Panic spread inside the court. Rivers considered internal highways were now foreign military channels. The Ming Dynasty believed China was the world's center. Now foreign ships sailed unhindered along its coast. The British demanded treaty ports, trade rights, and diplomatic equality, concepts that shattered tributary ideology. The Qing court had never before accepted the idea that foreign nations were political equals. Their worldview made negotiation nearly impossible. The Opium War was not only a military clash, it was a psychological collision between different concepts of world order. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, ended the war, reshaping China's future. The treaty forced China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 ports, permit foreign residents, pay massive compensation, and accept new tariffs. But while these terms were severe, their symbolic meaning was worse. The Qing dynasty lost control over Chinese territory for the first time in centuries. The empire's defeat revealed structural weaknesses: weak military modernization, outdated ideology, corrupt bureaucracy, internal division, and isolationist economics. The Opium War became a turning point. For the first time, China realized it faced a global power that could not be ignored. Yet China would not respond with modernization. Instead, internal turmoil deepened and collapse accelerated. The next segment will explore the era of unequal treaties and how this loss damaged Qing authority domestically. The Treaty of Nanjing ended the First Opium War, but rather than offering a temporary peace, it marked the beginning of what Chinese historians later termed the Century of Humiliation. The treaty represented the first in a long chain of agreements forced upon China under military pressure. The Qing court expected the treaty's obligations to be limited and temporary. They believed that once reparations were paid, foreign involvement would decline. Instead, Western nations intensified their demands, seizing opportunity in Qing vulnerability. The Treaty of Nanjing created a new legal environment. British citizens gained extraterritoriality, meaning they were subject not to Chinese law, but British courts. 5 treaty ports, Shanghai, Ningbo, Guangzhou, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, opened permanently to foreign residents and trade. Tariffs became fixed at low rates, eliminating Qing control over international customs. Hong Kong Island passed into British colonial possession. These terms shattered Qing's sovereignty. Local merchants suddenly faced direct competition against industrial goods. Western textiles undercut Chinese silk and cotton locally. Factories in Manchester produced fabric faster and cheaper than any Chinese guild. As foreign goods flooded treaty ports, Chinese domestic industries began collapsing. The Qing bureaucracy struggled to adapt. Officials trained in Confucian classics did not understand international law, maritime insurance, or capitalist competition. Their careers have been built upon essay writing, philosophy, and moral governance, not industrial economics or foreign diplomacy. Therefore, treaty enforcement fell under the supervision of foreign inspectors. Western consuls wielded power previously reserved for Chinese officers. Furthermore, foreign merchants soon demanded treaty revision. They argued trade regulation remained too restrictive and insisted China fully industrialize into global capitalism. This pressure triggered the Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860, a conflict just as devastating as the first. The Qing, already weakened internally, could not mount meaningful resistance. Anglo-French coalition forces captured Canton, burned the Summer Palace, and marched into Beijing. The resulting Treaty of Tianjin expanded foreign rights, legalized missionary activity, opened more ports, and deepened extraterritorial protections. But foreign pressure alone did not break the empire. The treaties destabilized Qing legitimacy at home. Ordinary people saw the dynasty surrender to foreign demands repeatedly. Mandate of heaven ideology suggested that rulers who failed to defend the realm had lost heaven's blessing. Rumors spread across villages that barbarians had conquered China spiritually even if they had not physically occupied the heartland. The court appeared weak, fearful, and incompetent. Economic crisis deepened. Silver flowed outward to pay treaty reparations. Taxes rose to compensate. Farmers already struggling with rising population faced heavier levies. Meanwhile, foreign merchants used treaty privileges to monopolize export goods, such as tea and silk. British factories in India began producing cheap cotton cloth that flooded rural markets. Chinese workers lost livelihoods. The disruption of rural economy encouraged migration into cities. Shanghai transformed from fishing port into a global metropolis. Foreign banks controlled trade currency. Chinese guilds shrank. Qing officials resented foreign power, but relied on customs revenue collected under foreign supervision to fund government activity. This conflict of interest prevented reform. Western missionaries added cultural tension. They introduced Christianity, challenged Confucian belief structures, and offered legal protection to converts. In rural areas, Christian villagers gained advantages over non-Christians, inflaming resentment. Anti-Christian riots emerged frequently. Qing officials often found themselves trapped between missionary pressure and local outrage. Meanwhile, Qing military decline became increasingly visible. Modern rifles, artillery, and naval vessels used by Western powers demonstrated the inadequacy of banner and green standard systems. Training, supply networks, and personal morale lagged behind foreign armies. Some Qing generals recognized the technological gap, but faced resistance from conservative officials who believed Western weapons would corrupt moral integrity. The end result was national confusion. Many Chinese elites realized that without modernization, China could not defend itself. Others insisted modernization would destroy tradition. Caught between ideological paralysis and foreign exploitation, the Qing state entered deep crisis. These conditions shaped an environment where internal rebellion could erupt on unprecedented scale. And it did, with the Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest civil wars in human history, emerging from poverty, Christian influence, ethnic resentment, and hatred toward a failing dynasty. The next segment explores this rebellion and how it nearly destroyed the Qing. The Taiping Rebellion, 1850 to 1864, embodied the violent convergence of social despair, ideological transformation, and imperial breakdown. Led by Hong Xiuquan, a failed examination candidate who believed he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, the movement blended Christianity with Chinese millenarian tradition and anti-Manchu nationalism. Hong drew followers from poor peasants, unemployed migrants, and rural communities devastated by overpopulation and taxation. The Taiping movement promised radical transformation, abolition of the Confucian order, communal land ownership, gender equality, and the destruction of the Qing dynasty. By the time the Taiping Heaven Kingdom reached peak power, it controlled nearly half of China and governed 30 million people. Hong Xiuquan's personal story reflects the frustrations of his generation. Having failed the civil service exam repeatedly, he suffered psychological breakdown and visionary dreams suggesting divine mission. He interpreted biblical teachings through Chinese cultural frameworks, believing himself chosen to purge demons, which he identified as Qing rulers. His religious message resonated because Chinese cosmic tradition already included apocalyptic belief cycles. Combined with widespread famine, land scarcity, and hatred of corrupt landlords, the idea of building a heavenly kingdom promised justice. The Taiping quickly evolved from religious sect to military state. They captured Nanjing in 1853 and renamed it Tianjin, heavenly capital. Military victories shocked the Qing, who had underestimated the movement. Taiping armies, trained rigorously and bound by religious discipline, overcame banner troops repeatedly. The Qing court panicked. The rebellion spread because traditional society could not contain demographic pressure. Young men without farmland, local militia captains seeking authority, and women oppressed under Confucian patriarchy joined eagerly. Taiping leaders offered equal land to men and women, the banning of foot binding, social mobility, and harsh punishment against corruption. To peasants, this sounded revolutionary, perhaps even heavenly. Yet Taiping governance carried contradictions. While preaching equality, Hong Xiuquan lived luxuriously. His policies forbidding alcohol and sexual relations alienated many. Internal power struggles erupted between leaders. Meanwhile, Qing forces reorganized under regional armies such as Zheng Guofanxiang Army and Li Hongzhang's Huai Army. Troops recruited locally and trained through Western-assisted modernization. These forces eventually gained strength superior to Taiping armies. Foreign powers complicated the conflict. Western nations initially admired Taiping anti-Manchu rhetoric, seeing opportunity to reshape China. But once Taiping attitudes toward trade and Christianity proved unpredictable, Britain and France supported the Qing instead. Foreign weapons, advisors, and shipyards enabled Qing regional armies to besiege Nanjing. The end of the rebellion was catastrophic. When Qing forces recaptured Nanjing in 1864, millions were dead across the countryside. Entire provinces lay ruined. Cities burned. Agricultural regions depopulated. The estimated death toll ranges from 20 to 40 million, making the Taiping rebellion deadlier than World War I and perhaps second only to World War II in casualties. The rebellion destroyed Qing legitimacy and military structure. It forced decentralization because regional armies, not banner troops, delivered victory. These same regional leaders would later challenge imperial authority and fragment the empire further. The decades following the Taiping rebellion forced the Ming Dynasty into a traumatic transformation. Where earlier Qing rulers had clung to ideological purity and cultural superiority, the mid-19th century exposed the empire's vulnerability. Foreign armies had defeated it. Internal uprisings had nearly destroyed it, and domestic governance lay fractured. In the aftermath, Qing leaders confronted a question that would shape modern China. Should the empire modernize to survive, or double down on traditional Confucian values? This debate fueled the self-strengthening movement, 1861 to 1895, a period in which Qing elites attempted selective modernization, importing Western military technology while keeping Confucian institutions intact. The starting point for reform was the realization that traditional military structures had failed. Banner forces and the Green Standard Army, once the backbone of imperial power, struggled against both domestic rebels and foreign troops. Instead, regional militias, created by Han elites such as Zheng Guofan, Zhongtong, and Li Hongzhang, had won the Taiping War. Their success redefined military hierarchy. Loyalty shifted from the emperor to provincial leaders, undermining central authority. Yet these same leaders became critical reformers. They argued that China must learn from the West, adopt rifles, artillery, shipbuilding, and telecommunications. Their slogan, Chinese learning supported moral foundation. Western learning applied for practical use, captured their intellectual compromise. They believed Confucianism should remain the soul of government, but Western technology could strengthen national defense. The self-strengthening movement produced impressive results. Jiangnan Arsenal in Shanghai manufactured rifles, steam engines, and ammunition. The Fuzhou shipyard trained naval officers and built modern ships. Railroads, telegraph lines, and modern schools appeared. Diplomatic missions traveled abroad to learn Western statecraft. Students were sent to the United States for education under the Chinese Educational Mission, an unprecedented act for a dynasty that had once rejected all foreign cultural influence. These reforms demonstrated that parts of the Qing leadership recognized China's changed world. Yet the movement suffered fatal contradictions. Reformers wanted Western weapons, but not Western ideas. They built modern ships, but staffed them with officials chosen through traditional clan networks instead of merit. New industries clashed with Confucian values that prioritized agriculture over commerce. Many elites saw merchants as socially inferior and did not trust them to run factories or banks. Thus, industrial development lacked financial organization. Without a banking system or capitalist structure, Qing arsenals struggled to produce enough weapons or maintain a navy. Court politics also damaged reform. The Tongji Emperor was young, and real power rested with Empress Dowager Cixi and Prince Gong. Cixi initially supported modernization, but feared any reform that might threaten imperial control. She allowed technology, but resisted political restructuring, ignoring constitutional proposals, educational reform for masses, or modernization of civil service exams. She believed China could modernize militarily without altering traditional governance. Compounding these internal problems was the disastrous 1875 succession crisis. When the Tongji Emperor died without an heir, Cixi placed her 3-year-old nephew on the throne as the Guangxu Emperor. This ensured she could continue ruling as regent, but it weakened imperial continuity. With child emperors, the court remained dependent on advisors, promoting factionalism and slowing reform. Despite modernization efforts, Qing foreign relations deteriorated. Russia advanced in Central Asia, taking territory in Xinjiang and the Ili region. Japan, rapidly modernizing after the 1868 Meiji Restoration, industrialized its military and bureaucracy. Western powers pressed China for more treaty privileges. In rural society, rebellion persisted. Muslim uprisings in Yunnan and Xinjiang, Yin uprisings in northern plains, and smaller revolts spread. At the self-strengthening movement's core lay unresolved conflict. Could China remain culturally Confucian while adopting Western technology? Reformers believed yes. Conservatives believed no. The empire attempted compromise, but history showed that compromise modernization, technology without structural reform, was insufficient to protect China from foreign aggression. This contradiction would explode during the Sino-French and Sino-Japanese wars. These conflicts revealed that although Qing elites understood what was necessary to survive, they lacked political unity, funding, and administrative coordination. In the next segment, we explore how defeat at foreign hands shattered Qing confidence, accelerating collapse. The Sino-French and Sino-Japanese wars demonstrated the tragic limits of Qing modernization and exposed the empire to humiliation that rivaled the Opium War. The state ideology promised moral purity, but real politics demanded compromise and deception. This ideological contradiction damaged faith in government. Furthermore, elite society increasingly turned to escapist culture. Literati indulged in garden aesthetics, romantic poetry, and personal pleasure, often ignoring rural poverty. Many refused government office entirely, living as hermits or philosophical wanderers. While this tradition enriched Chinese culture, it also represented political withdrawal. At the same time, the Ming court lost contact with common people who struggled under taxation, famine, and natural disaster. Urban consumer culture emerged strongly in the late Ming. Bookstores, theater districts, and markets flourished. People bought paintings, calligraphy, exotic goods, and luxury ceramics. Commodification of culture made society vibrant, but also materialistic. Intellectuals feared that China had lost moral focus. In a sense, the Ming collapse was a moral crisis as much as a military one. When famine struck and peasants rebelled, many elites believed the dynasty had lost heaven's mandate. This belief was psychological rather than rational. Once the idea spread, loyalty evaporated. Soldiers abandoned garrisons, peasants refused taxes, and generals switched sides. Ming legitimacy dissolved from the inside before the Qing conquered from the outside. The Qing inherited this cultural trauma. In the early Qing period, culture shifted dramatically. The Manchus promoted Confucian classicism, emphasizing moral discipline, ritual hierarchy, and state censorship. They used cultural authority, to legitimize rule. Early Qing painting, especially the Orthodox school, emphasized calm landscapes and moral restraint, mirroring political goals of harmony and control. However, Qing culture also innovated. Court painters like Castiglione fused European realism with Chinese technique. Poetry continued flourishing. The Sino-French War, 1884 to 1885, began over control of Vietnam. For centuries, Vietnam had been part of China's cultural tributary system, but France's imperial expansion in Southeast Asia threatened that influence. Qing reformers saw defending Vietnam as a chance to prove that new military structures could protect Chinese geopolitical space. Yet internal division undermined military readiness. Li Zicheng, the leading reformer of the period, argued against war, believing China needed time to complete modernization. Conservative factions in Beijing, however, pushed for conflict, eager to reclaim respect lost during previous defeats. They saw Vietnam as a testing ground for China's new navy and industrial arsenal. Empress Dowager Cixi approved military engagement despite unpreparedness. The war ended in mixed results tactically, but disastrous results strategically. Chinese land forces performed better than expected in Tonkin, northern Vietnam, at times holding ground against French troops. But at sea, the Chinese Navy faced near-total destruction. The Fuzhou fleet, built with enormous investment, was annihilated by the French Far East Squadron at the Battle of Fuzhou. The fleet had modern ships, but leadership and training were disastrous. Officers were appointed through patronage, not merit. Ammunition supply was inadequate. Guns malfunctioned. Sailors lacked combat experience. The French Navy, using superior maneuvering tactics and explosive shells, destroyed nearly every Chinese vessel within hours. The loss shocked the Qing court and marked the first major demonstration that selective modernization without institutional reform was ineffective. Yet an even more traumatic event was coming: the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895. This conflict symbolized China's fall from regional dominance. Japan, once a participant in China's cultural orbit, had transformed under the Meiji Restoration into an industrial nation-state. It replaced samurai with modern armies, railroads, steamships, telegraphs, and constitutional government. While China remained bound to dynastic tradition, Japan built national identity through adaptation. Thus, when conflict erupted over Korea, a region that both nations viewed as strategic, Japan entered war organized, unified, and technologically advanced. China approached the conflict unprepared. Despite Li Hongzhang's warnings, court conservatives believed that Japan could never defeat the Qing Empire. They assumed geographic size and population equaled strength. But war demonstrated how modernization, not population, determined military capability. Japan's army used Western rifles, artillery, and coordinated command structures. Chinese armies relied on outdated rifles, poor communication, and conflicting provincial command systems. Japan's navy, modeled on British design, possessed ironclads and disciplined officers. China's Beiyang fleet looked modern on paper, yet suffered from corruption, missing armor, stolen ammunition budgets, and political fragmentation. The war began with crushing defeats at Asin and Pyongyang, followed by catastrophic naval disaster at the Yellow Sea. Chinese ships were slower, badly equipped, and poorly commanded. Provincial governments refused to cooperate, and ship repair budgets have been redirected to imperial palace renovations at the Summer Palace under Cixi. The dynasty literally redirected warship funds to build gardens and decorative architecture. Japan captured Port Arthur and Weihaiwei, breaking Chinese morale. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan, recognize Korea's independence, placing Korea under Japanese influence, pay massive indemnities, and open more ports to trade. The psychological impact was enormous. Japan, once viewed as culturally inferior, now dominated East Asia. The defeat shattered faith in the Qing leadership and ended illusions of Chinese superiority. Reformers demanded total modernization, constitutional government, industrial education, modern banking, and legal overhaul. Yet conservatives resisted violently, believing reform threatened imperial identity. Foreign imperialists seized the moment. Russia took control of Port Arthur and extended dominance into Manchuria. Germany seized Qingdao. Britain expanded into the Yangtze region. France carved additional territory in the south. Western powers imposed spheres of influence across the empire. Qing's sovereignty dissolved piece by piece, not through direct colonization, but through global capitalism, military coercion, and legal restrictions. The Sino-Japanese defeat thus marked a turning point in world history. The old Asian order, China at the center, collapsed. A new order, dominated by industrial Japan and colonial Europe, emerged. China faced not only territorial loss, but existential crisis. Disillusioned intellectuals began questioning Confucianism, dynastic loyalty, and imperial stability. Radical reform movements emerged. Students demanded constitutional monarchy. Merchants demanded business rights. Industrial interests demanded tariff reform. Local militias demanded political autonomy. The empire was splintering. The next segment will examine the 100 Days Reform, the Boxer Rebellion, and the political chaos consuming the Ming Dynasty in the early 20th century. After the humiliating Sino-Japanese defeat, China entered a phase of desperate reform attempts mixed with volatile conservative backlash. Reformers saw Japan's success as proof that Western-style modernization was not only possible, but urgently necessary. They argued that preserving Confucian order required structural change, modernization of education, legal restructuring, constitutional monarchy, and mass literacy. Meanwhile, conservatives viewed Japan's transformation as betrayal of civilization and insisted that China remain ideologically pure. This ideological war came to a head in the movement known as the 100 Days Reform of 1898. Two prominent reformers, Kang Yuwei and Liang Qichao, led intellectual efforts to persuade the Guangxu Emperor to restructure governance. They proposed sweeping reforms, abolishing outdated examination systems, creating national universities, modernizing the military, establishing elected local assemblies, promoting industry, sending more students abroad, and reducing aristocratic power. The Guangxu Emperor, frustrated with Qing's stagnation, embraced reform passionately. For the first time in centuries, the Qing court attempted to remake the empire along constitutional lines. Factories expanded production, schools adopted Western science curricula, and provincial officials received orders to modernize administration. However, the movement lasted only about 3 months before collapsing. Empress Dowager Cixi, who still controlled political networks in the court, saw the reforms as a direct threat to imperial power and traditional identity. She believed rapid modernization would destabilize society and potentially overthrow the dynasty. In September 1898, she staged a coup, placed Guangxu under house arrest, executed reform supporters, and reversed most changes. The failure of the 100 Days Reform delivered a chilling lesson. The Qing court was incapable of transforming itself internally, even in the face of national crisis. The empire now faced angry intellectuals, disillusioned merchants, rebellious provincial armies, and growing anti-foreign resentment. This resentment erupted violently in the Boxer Rebellion, 1899 to 1901, an uprising driven by secret societies, martial art belief, and anti-Christian sentiment. The Boxers, peasants who practiced ritualized spirit possession, believed that foreign bullets could not harm them spiritually. They hated missionaries, foreign merchants, and railroads, viewing them as destroyers of Chinese tradition. They also believed, accurately, that foreign presence deepened Chinese poverty. Local officials initially suppressed the Boxers, but Cixi later reversed course, seeing an opportunity to redirect anger against foreign intrusion. She endorsed the Boxers and declared war on foreign nations, believing that righteous spiritual power and large population could overwhelm modern armies. Instead, disaster followed. 8 international powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the United States sent combined forces to Beijing. Their troops crushed Boxer fighters easily, marched into Beijing, looted the capital, and forced the Qing to sign the Boxer Protocol in 1901. The protocol demanded massive reparations, foreign military stations in Beijing, and legal immunity for foreign actions. The humiliation was unmatched. For many Chinese, the Qing government appeared completely incompetent, unable to modernize, unable to protect against rebels, unable to defend against foreigners, and unable to restore unity. Yet, ironically, the defeat forced the Qing to adopt modernization measures they had resisted for decades. After 1901, the dynasty finally abolished the civil service exam, created provincial assemblies, expanded police forces, modernized the military, and drafted constitutional plans. But these reforms came too late. Local governments already controlled armies independent of the throne. Provincial élites de mandido autonomy. Intellectuals abandoned Confucianism and turned to new ideologies: socialism, republicanism, nationalism. By the time the 20th century dawned, the Qing state was an empty shell. Externally, foreign nations divided influence across Chinese territory. Internally, people no longer believed the dynasty deserved loyalty. The next phase of China's crisis would soon produce the 1911 revolution, and with it, the end of more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. By the early 20th century, the Qing dynasty existed as a weakened institution struggling to maintain even symbolic authority. Internally, the dynasty faced ideological fragmentation, regional militarization, and a population that no longer viewed the monarchy as the center of political legitimacy. Externally, imperialist aggression by foreign powers reshaped Chinese economy, territory, and diplomacy, reducing Qing government to a dependent participant in international affairs rather than an autonomous actor. The dynasty's reforms came too late and lacked coherence. The world had fundamentally shifted, while Qing leadership clung to beliefs shaped centuries earlier. To understand the Qing collapse, one must examine the structure of late reforms. After the Boxer Rebellion, foreign powers demanded that China modernize to maintain internal order and protect international interests. Ironically, this forced modernization was meant to preserve the dynasty, but ultimately accelerated its demise. The Qing court introduced constitutional promises, created provincial assemblies, modernized judicial systems, and attempted military reform. But reform unfolded unevenly and without strategic vision. The abolition of the civil service examination system in 1905 represented a symbolic turning point. For more than 1,300 years, imperial exams had served as the ideological foundation of Chinese governance. Scholars built careers on mastering Confucian texts, and social mobility depended on exam achievement. Ending the exams destroyed the traditional pathway to elite status. Thousands of scholars trained for Confucian bureaucracy suddenly found their education obsolete. Without new systems to replace old ones, a generation of intellectuals became alienated, fueling anti-Qing discourse. Military reform also destabilized the dynasty. New model armies were trained using German and Japanese systems, emphasizing officer professionalism and modern weaponry. But instead of becoming loyal to the central throne, these forces became loyal to provincial commanders who organized and paid them. Yuan Shikai, commander of the Beiyang army, emerged as the strongest military figure in China. The Qing court believed Yuan could be controlled, but in reality, he wielded more military influence than the emperor himself. Meanwhile, provincial assemblies empowered local elites who gained political legitimacy, tax control, and administrative experience previously reserved for imperial officials. These assemblies became political incubators for nationalism and republican thought. Provinces began imagining political futures independent of imperial rule. Ironically, reforms intended to strengthen the empire merely strengthened the regions. Intellectual currents also shifted dramatically. The spread of newspapers, vernacular literature, and translation made new political ideas accessible to common people. Marxism, liberalism, nationalism, and social Darwinism traveled along trade routes and print culture. Chinese students studying abroad, especially in Japan, returned with radical critiques of monarchy. Western concepts such as parliamentary democracy, constitutional law, and separation of powers entered Chinese vocabulary. The imperial ideology of mandate of heaven no longer convinced younger generations. Socioeconomic crisis reinforced ideological transformation. Rural tax burdens increased as the Qing attempted to pay foreign indemnities. Natural disasters intensified suffering, floods, droughts, famine. Peasants starved while the court continued ceremonial spending. Industrial workers in treaty ports faced low wages, dangerous conditions, and foreign control over factories. Labor strikes emerged alongside student protests, and urban activism grew. Ethnic nationalism further undermined the Qing. The dynasty's Manchu identity became a political liability. Revolutionaries argued that China should be ruled by the Han majority, not by a foreign minority group. For centuries, the Qing had integrated multiple ethnic groups into imperial identity. But now, nationalism rewrote identity along racial lines. To be Chinese meant to reject Manchu rule. Anti-Manchu sentiments spread across the empire. The Qing court, desperate to stabilize its legitimacy, chose Pu Yi, a 2-year-old, to become emperor after the Guangxu emperor died. A child emperor in an age of revolution symbolized a dynasty out of time. Real power rested with regents and military factions. The dynasty lacked charismatic leadership to unify the nation. Meanwhile, revolutionary networks led by Sun Yat-sen spread republican ideology across southern China. Sun envisioned a modern republic based on 3 principles: nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. He raised funds abroad, gained support from overseas Chinese communities, and built alliances with secret societies such as the Tongminghui. The Qing faced enemies everywhere. Intellectuals seeking republic, generals seeking autonomy, peasants seeking relief, merchants seeking freedom, minorities seeking independence, and students seeking ideological transformation. By 1911, the empire's foundations were gone. Only the crisis spark was missing, and it would soon ignite. The spark that transformed long-term decay into sudden revolution came from a seemingly minor event: the railway protection movement. This conflict began with government plans to nationalize provincial railway projects in Hunan, Hubei, Sichuan, and Guangdong to pay foreign loans. Railroads had become symbols of regional autonomy and modern pride. Merchants, landowners, and gentry had invested heavily into these railways, believing they would strengthen local economies and protect interests from foreign control. When the Qing announced it would seize the railways and mortgage them to European investors, public anger erupted. The conflict intensified when provincial assemblies condemned the policy as selling the nation. Mass protests spread across Sichuan. The governor-general attempted repression, sending troops to arrest leaders. But this reaction provoked rebellion. On September 24, 1911, the Sichuan Railway Protection Army clashed with government forces, leading to mass casualties. In response, the Qing redirected Beiyang troops, China's best-trained forces, away from central China to suppress Sichuan rebellion. This strategic decision weakened defenses in Hubei province, where revolutionary cells had planned uprisings. On October 10, 1911, revolutionaries in Wuchang launched a mutiny after police discovered secret Tongminghui membership lists and attempted arrests. The uprising was not planned as a grand national event, but once it began, it triggered chain reactions. The Beiyang garrison soldiers, many sympathetic to revolutionary ideals, refused to fire on rebels. They joined instead. Wuchang fell quickly, surprising both the Qing court and revolutionaries themselves. Within days, news traveled across China. Provincial assemblies and military units debated alignment. Surprisingly, province after province declared independence from Qing rule. Hunan, Shaanxi, Jiangxi, Yunnan, Anhui, and Guangdong all announced secession within weeks. This collective political revolt demonstrated how deeply Qing legitimacy had eroded. Provinces refused to shed blood to defend a dynasty they no longer believed in. Sun Yat-sen was abroad when the revolution began, raising funds in the United States. He hurried to return, shocked that China had risen without his direct leadership. Revolutionaries proclaimed the Republic of China in Nanjing and elected Sun the provisional president. The Qing court, terrified by the speed of disintegration, turned to Yuan Shikai. Yuan held the most powerful modern army in China and had deep political experience. The court appointed him prime minister and begged him to crush the revolution. But Yuan saw opportunity. He negotiated secretly with revolutionaries, offering to support the republic if he could become president under their system. Revolutionaries reluctantly agreed because they lacked national military strength. Yuan persuaded Empress Dowager Longyu, acting regent for the child Emperor Pu Yi, to abdicate. On February 12, 1912, the last emperor of China was dethroned. The emperor was allowed to remain in the Forbidden City temporarily under special arrangement, symbolizing a peaceful end to 2 millennia of imperial rule. The abdication declaration marked more than a political change. It marked a civilizational transformation. For the first time since Qin Shi Huang unified China in 221 BCE, the imperial system ended. Dynastic cycles, Confucian monarchy, and mandate of heaven ideology collapsed. China attempted parliamentary republicanism, hoping to join the modern world. However, beneath the surface, problems emerged. Yuan Shikai did not view himself as servant of democracy. He saw the republic as a tool to elevate personal power. His Beiyang army remained loyal to him, not to the republic. Sun Yat-sen's southern revolutionaries distrusted Yuan, fearing military dictatorship. Regionalism, already strong during the late Qing, continued into the new era. Meanwhile, foreign imperialist influence remained. Treaty ports persisted. Western militaries maintained station rights. Japan watched closely, waiting to expand power. China entered the Republican era with optimism, but the foundations were unstable. The Qing dynasty's collapse did not solve land inequality, poverty, or national identity. It merely removed the imperial framework that had once unified China. Without central authority, China risked slipping into warlordism, a fate that would define the next decades. Print culture expanded further due to better woodblock technology. Cities experienced entertainment explosions. Theater became mainstream, producing Qing opera and Beijing opera traditions that remain iconic today. Qing novels like Dream of the Red Chamber reached new psychological depth, portraying emotional life of aristocratic decline and symbolizing dynasty's fragile condition. Yet this cultural brilliance also masked creeping decay. By the 19th century, artistic taste detached from real social needs. Educated elites debated textual details rather than engaging with industrial shockwaves. Examination culture continued producing scholars trained for a world that no longer existed. The psychological relationship between ruler and ruled deteriorated. Under Kangxi and Yuanzhang, emperors toured regions, spoke with peasants, and issued public moral judgments. Under Daoguang and Guangxu, emperors became distant symbols isolated inside the Forbidden City, rarely interacting outside palace walls. Common people suffered psychological trauma from endless crises. Opium addiction spread. Floods destroyed farms. Officials demanded bribes. Rebellions devastated towns. Foreign soldiers bombarded coasts. As a result, people lost emotional loyalty toward dynasty. They no longer saw emperor as heavenly protector. They saw empire failing to secure basic survival. This cultural, psychological collapse resembles patterns found in the Ming downfall. Artistic brilliance alongside social despair, intellectual refinement alongside bureaucratic suffocation, moral nostalgia alongside political weakness. Culture flourished even as state confidence evaporated. While history often focuses on emperors, generals, and scholars, dynasties ultimately rest on the lives of ordinary people. The Ming Qing transition transformed daily existence across China, changing how people ate, dressed, farmed, traveled, married, worshipped, and understood their identity. The fall of the Qing was not only a political event. It represented the disintegration of the ideological system that shaped Chinese civilization for millennia. The next segment explores the cultural meaning of this collapse and why the Ming Qing transition shaped China's future identity forever. To understand the deeper significance of the Qing collapse, it is important to trace how the dynasty's fall reshaped Chinese identity, historical memory, and national consciousness. For centuries, the Chinese experienced history through dynastic cycles: rise, golden age, decline, moral failure, and renewal. This worldview predicted that when a dynasty lost virtue, heaven would withdraw legitimacy and appoint a new ruling house. The 1911 revolution broke that structure permanently. When the Qing fell, no new dynasty replaced it. Instead, China stepped into the modern nation-state world, where legitimacy derived from constitutions, political participation, and nationalism rather than heaven's mandate. The Qing collapse also transformed cultural definitions of China. Under imperial rule, China was understood as a multi-ethnic civilization centered on Han, Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, and Muslim peoples unified through imperial authority. After 1911, nationalism began redefining China as a Han-majority nation, pushing ethnic diversity to the margins. This shift created tensions that continue shaping politics today. Moreover, the end of the Qing forced China to confront Western industrial modernity. For the first time, Chinese elites understood that history was not cyclical but linear, that nations must compete technologically, economically, and militarily in continuous progress. This worldview led to radical questions. What should be preserved? What should be discarded? Could Confucianism coexist with democracy? Could socialism replace monarchy? Intellectual debates that followed shaped the May 4th movement, Chinese communism, the Nationalist Party, and the warlord era. The fall of the Qing also exposed structural weaknesses that had existed since Ming times. Inland agrarian economy versus coastal industrial trade. Bureaucratic rigidity versus technological innovation. Confucian moral order versus global capitalism. Centralized governance versus provincial autonomy. These tensions did not disappear with the Qing. Instead, they persisted into the Republic, the Civil War era, and even modern China. On a personal level, Qing collapse was emotionally devastating for many. Scholar families lost identity and purpose. Examination masters, trained their entire lives in classical texts, had no place in modern industry or government. Former nobles became ordinary civilians overnight. Banner communities, financially supported for generations, fell into poverty once stipends ended. Thousands of Manchu families left Beijing or were attacked by revenge mobs. Women raised in imperial households found themselves culturally alienated as the nation embraced new ideas like feminism, science, and democracy. Culturally, Qing art, architecture, and literature fell out of fashion. People associated the dynasty with weakness and humiliation rather than aesthetic achievement. Only later, long after the dust settled, did historians re-examine Qing contributions objectively. Perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. The Chinese people lost imperial certainty. For thousands of years, China believed itself to be the center of world civilization. After the Qing collapse, that belief dissolved. The nation recognized its vulnerability. This awakening produced anger, shame, hope, creativity, and revolution. As the Ming Dynasty once collapsed because of corruption, rebellion, famine, and foreign invasion, the Qing fell through almost parallel conditions, exposing long-term patterns in Chinese history. But unlike previous transitions, 1911 ended not with another emperor, but with the beginning of a new world, modern China. To understand the long arc of Chinese history, from the fall of the Ming Dynasty in 1644 to the end of the Qing Dynasty in 1912, one must step back and examine history as a continuous cultural, political, and structural process. The collapse of the Ming and the eventual collapse of the Qing were not isolated failures. They were intimately connected by deep patterns that shaped Chinese civilization for centuries. When the Ming fell, China entered a new era under Manchu rule. Yet many of the underlying problems that eroded Ming authority persisted or evolved under new forms. Examining these patterns reveals why Chinese leaders today continue to interpret their past not as a random series of collapses, but as a system of long-term lessons, shaping national ideology and strategic thinking. The Ming Dynasty began to crumble due to corruption, military breakdown, climate crisis, population strain, and internal rebellion. The Qing inherited a nation already on edge. Their first challenge was to restore legitimacy. They did this by adopting Confucian state ideology, maintaining the civil examination system, stabilizing agriculture, and attempting to heal the imperial economy. Early Qing rulers succeeded brilliantly. Kangxi, Yuanzhang, and Qianlong built one of the most powerful regimes in world history. They expanded Chinese territory to unprecedented size, integrated frontier peoples, revived trade networks, and stabilized government revenue. Under Kangxi, the Qing represented a confident empire. Under Qianlong, they represented a universal empire. Yet prosperity can hide danger. The Qing Golden Age masked accumulating weaknesses: military complacency, demographic overload, administrative rigidities, and over-reliance on agrarian tax structures. The Ming faced similar problems, but the Qing faced them on an even larger scale because the empire's population had doubled and its territory expanded dramatically. The Qing ruled far more land than the Ming, but their institutional tools remained similar. Their ability to manage crises depended heavily on the emperor's competence. Great emperors created stability. Weak successors permitted decline. This system worked beautifully under Kangxi and Yuanzhang, but offered little protection once imperial authority weakened. A major legacy of the Qing Empire lies in its territorial structure. Modern China's borders, including Xinjiang, Tibet, Mongolia, inner regions, Manchuria, Taiwan, and parts of the southwest, were incorporated or consolidated under Qing rule. These borders outlasted the dynasty and shaped China's national identity. Without Qing expansion, modern China would look geographically smaller, culturally narrower, and strategically weaker. Qing rule connected multiple civilizations under one imperial umbrella, producing a complex multi-ethnic state. Today, when China claims historical continuity over regions like Tibet or Xinjiang, it often references Qing imperial precedent. Another legacy is the cultural interaction between China and the outside world. Under the Qing, Jesuit missionaries brought astronomy, mathematics, and cartography. Chinese art absorbed Western shading techniques, while Chinese porcelain transformed global aesthetics. Maritime trade connected Fujian and Guangdong with Southeast Asia, Japan, and Western markets. Qing society, despite its Confucian conservatism, was never isolated. Even Qianlong, famously dismissive toward Lord Macartney, relied on Jesuit science and Western craft. The Qing legacy also includes harsh lessons about institutional stagnation. Ming scholars believed moral governance alone could sustain empire. Qing scholars believed the same. But moral philosophy could not rebuild canals, modernize armies, or resist industrial capitalism. When Western powers arrived with steamships and cannons, Qing officials found themselves trapped between tradition and survival. Their reluctance to modernize politically and militarily ultimately left the empire vulnerable. The Ming collapsed under internal rebellion and external invasion. The Qing collapsed under internal rebellion and external imperialism. The similarity demonstrates how Chinese dynastic government, long successful, eventually became structurally outdated by the 19th century. In addition, the Qing collapse reshaped global nationalism. Chinese thinkers learned that modern identity must be built not on dynasty, but on nationhood. Confucian loyalty to emperor transformed into loyalty to the concept of China itself. Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qichao, Lu Sun, and later Mao Zedong all emerged from the ideological world created by the Qing's failures. Thus, the dynasty's fall did not end China. It transformed it. Segment 2 will examine how Qing collapse shaped early Republican China and why the empire's legacies still influence modern Chinese politics today. The end of the Qing dynasty did not erase imperial structures instantly. Instead, Qing legacies embedded themselves into the fabric of modern Chinese governance. Even as the new republic celebrated breaking away from autocracy, it inherited the Qing's structural challenges: huge population, weak centralization, cultural divisions, foreign pressure, and regional warlordism. The Qing had maintained unity because the imperial court held a monopoly on legitimacy. Once that legitimacy vanished, China struggled to build new forms of authority. The first issue was warlordism. During the last decades of the Qing, provincial armies led by Han officials such as Zheng He, Li Zicheng, and Zhu Yuanzhang had saved the dynasty from rebellion. But their successors retained regional power after the dynasty fell. Although the Beiyang army under Yuan Shikai was the most powerful, other provincial armies, Sichuan, Yunnan, Guangxi, Hunan, Anhui, remained semi-independent. The Qing never regained full military centralization after the Taiping Rebellion. The Republic inherited this decentralization. Provincial rulers collected taxes, operated prisons, ran post offices, and formed trade relationships without central oversight. This fragmentation reflected a deeper truth. Qing's central authority had weakened long before its collapse. Even during the Ming Dynasty's final century, the state failed to feed armies, maintain infrastructure, or manage elite corruption. The Qing reversed these patterns temporarily under strong emperors, but once imperial rule faded, structural flaws re-emerged. The Republic inherited a weakened administrative skeleton, making national rebuilding nearly impossible. The second issue was foreign domination. The unequal treaty system, carved deep into Qing's sovereignty, remained in effect after 1912. Foreign concessions in Shanghai, Tianjin, and Hankow stayed under European legal jurisdiction. Tariff autonomy remained restricted. Missionaries continued operating schools and churches. Japan continued expanding influence in Korea and Manchuria. China had overthrown its dynasty, but not its semi-colonial status. The third issue involved cultural identity crisis. The Qing had united diverse cultures: Manchu, Mongol, Tibetan, Uyghur, Han, under imperial cosmology. After the revolution, Republican nationalism struggled to replace that worldview. Han-centered nationalism gained momentum, but this posed existential questions. How should China incorporate non-Han regions? Should Tibet and Mongolia remain connected? Were Muslims in Xinjiang part of the new Chinese nation or separate? These debates sparked political conflict well into the 20th century, contributing to civil war and regional separatism. Another legacy of Qing collapse was ideological transformation. The Confucian system, dominant for nearly 2 millennia, lost institutional foundation. Scholars who once memorized classics to gain office confronted unemployment. This disruption sparked cultural revolution long before the Communist Revolution. The new culture movement of the 1910s and 1920s demanded science, democracy, vernacular literature, and feminism. Writers like Chun Duxiu and Hu Shi promoted secular scholarship and linguistic reform. The May 4th movement of 1919 radicalized students and laid foundations for Chinese communism. Mao Zedong himself emerged from intellectual environments created by Qing decline. But despite revolutionary rhetoric, Qing political techniques survived. Modern Chinese government, both nationalist and communist, retained strong centralized authority, emphasis on bureaucratic hierarchy, and state influence over culture. The Communist Party later revived merit examinations, administrative planning, and territorial centralization, echoing imperial governance. In a sense, Qing political DNA survived inside new political bodies. Even structural issues like taxation persisted. Qing tax collection, based on fixed quotas and land assessment, remained difficult to modernize. The Republic struggled to fund armies, infrastructure, and industry. Warlords financed activities through opium trafficking, echoing Qing corruption. Education modernization, begun in late Qing, accelerated under the Republic. Schools adopted Western science and humanities. Universities emerged. Yet political instability prevented consistent national curriculum. Regional differences widened. Shanghai embraced modern ideas, while rural regions retained traditional teaching. Economically, Qing legacy shaped industrial geography. Treaty port cities became centers of manufacturing and finance. Railroads followed trade routes established under foreign concession rule. The Republic innately depended on British and Japanese investment, causing structural vulnerability. Culturally, nostalgia for dynastic stability persisted. Many Chinese intellectuals admired the Qing Golden Age, particularly Kangxi and Qianlong, seeing them as symbols of unity and prosperity. Literature romanticized the Manchu court, while others vilified it as oppressive. Qing history became battleground for political identity. Understanding these legacies helps explain why the Ming Qing transition remains essential for interpreting modern China. It shows that political collapse happens not only through battle, but through economic imbalance, ideological rigidity, and institutional exhaustion. It shows how deep structural problems can survive dynastic change. And it demonstrates why states must evolve or risk destruction. Modern China's leadership frequently studies the Ming Qing experience to understand how great dynasties rise and fall. While contemporary China is not a monarchy, many ideological continuities remain. The Ming and Qing collapses taught Chinese thinkers several core historical lessons that influence political narratives in the 21st century. First, both dynasties fell partly due to internal corruption. Ming court politics descended into factional warfare, eunuch domination, and financial mismanagement. The Qing government likewise suffered catastrophic corruption under Hushan and his networks. Modern Chinese rhetoric often points to this legacy as warning. Corruption is not a moral inconvenience. It is a threat to national survival. Anti-corruption campaigns in present-day China frequently invoke dynastic collapse as justification. Second, both empires fell because they misunderstood global change. The Ming underestimated maritime power and ignored rising European colonial networks. The Qing underestimated industrial power and dismissed European technological revolutions. Modern China, therefore, emphasizes technological self-sufficiency, military modernization, and scientific education. Leaders publicly argue that China must never again fall behind technologically. Third, both dynasties collapsed during demographic and economic crisis. Population outgrew resources, land shrank, and famine spread. Today, China views economic stagnation as existential threat. Maintaining growth is described not only as policy, but national security priority. Fourth, both dynasties fell after military decline. Ming armies could not stop peasant uprisings or Manchu conquest. Qing armies could not resist European firepower or Japanese modernization. Modern China therefore invests heavily in military strength, navy development, and cybersecurity, while teaching students that military weakness invites invasion. Fifth, both dynasties fell because central authority eroded and regional power increased. Warlordism after the Qing showed what happens when provinces overpower government. Today, Beijing emphasizes central control, fearing fragmentation similar to Ming collapse, Taiping separatism, and warlord China. Sixth, ideology played major roles. The Ming tried to preserve orthodoxy through isolation. The Qing clung to Confucian ritual at the expense of modernization. Modern China therefore balances ideological control with economic reform, and warns that cultural disunity leads to national weakness. Even China's present territorial claims reflect Qing history. Borders created under the Qing allowed modern China to assert sovereignty over Tibet and Xinjiang. Without Qing imperial expansion, modern China might resemble a smaller Han-only nation-state. Beyond state policy, cultural identity also draws from Qing legacy. Chinese nationalism inherited Qing multi-ethnic empire identity rather than Ming Han ethnic identity. While modern nationalism emphasizes Han culture, territorial legitimacy depends on Qing-style integration. For example, Inner Mongolia remains part of China because Qing banners once ruled it. Qing history therefore underpins modern Chinese sovereignty claims. Globally, the Qing collapse shaped how China interacts with foreign powers. The memory of humiliation, the Opium War, treaty ports, burned palaces, remains an emotional foundation for diplomatic assertiveness. Modern Chinese foreign policy rejects unequal treaties and insists on equal international status, based on memory of past subjugation. Even Chinese culture today carries Qing influence. Beijing opera evolved under Qing patronage. Literary styles from Qing classics remain widely read. Family structures mirror Qing social laws. The dynasty's ghost remains embedded in China's cultural DNA. Thus, the Ming Qing transformation was not merely regime change. It was a civilizational rebirth. The Qing built the foundation of modern China's borders, identity, and national memory. Its collapse cleared the path for republicanism and later communism, shaping today's global China. To fully grasp how the Qing dynasty rose as a dominant force after the Ming collapse, one must examine in detail the structural military failures that plagued the Ming state during its final century. The Ming military collapse was not the result of a single lost battle or a sudden leadership vacuum. It represented a century-long decline in military professionalism, technological stagnation, bureaucratic dysfunction, and ideological inflexibility. Ironically, the Ming dynasty began as a military powerhouse. Zhu Yuanzhang, the dynasty's founder, built his rule on peasant armies and strict discipline. Border garrisons maintained constant watch along the Great Wall, and the Ming Navy once ruled the Indian Ocean under Zheng He. They used Confucian values to bridge cultural differences, enforcing bureaucracy across ethnicity. Qing territorial identity became centerpiece of modern China. Tibet was integrated under Qing protectorate. Xinjiang was conquered after Zhunger genocide. Taiwan became Qing territory. Manchuria, Mongolia, and Qinghai became imperial frontiers. These lands form borders of modern People's Republic of China. Without the Qing, modern China would be far smaller, and perhaps fragmented like Europe. Ethnic identity under Qing also created social tension. Banner elites enjoyed privileges that angered Han gentry. Han resentment remained latent until 19th century nationalism reawakened Ming memory. Revolutionary leaders argued Qing were alien rulers, undeserving of mandate. Anti-Manchu racism became political strategy, especially in Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement. Identity evolved again after imperial fall. The new republic promoted Han nationalism as glue for unity. But later communist leaders revived Qing multi-ethnic identity to justify territorial integrity. Modern China paradoxically blends Han nationalism with Qing imperial borders. Urban identity changed too. Ming cities were scholarly centers dominated by literati culture. Qing cities became commercial hubs filled with merchants, artisans, bankers, theater clubs, and foreign enclaves. Urban life diversified identity beyond rural Confucian values. By late Qing, Shanghai citizens felt cosmopolitan. They read foreign newspapers, ate Western food, and spoke hybrid dialects. Their identity differed sharply from interior peasants. Regional identity shaped rebellion patterns. Taiping rebellion grew from Cantonese Hakka identity, Nian revolt from northern rural identity, Muslim uprisings from Islamic frontier identity. Qing collapse was not an national event alone. It was thousands of local identity crises occurring simultaneously. Intellectual identity also transformed. Scholars no longer defined themselves solely through Confucian mastery. They became journalists, activists, industrial planners, political scientists, and translators. Identity shifted from scholar official to professional citizen. Peasant identity changed through hardship. Under Ming, peasants still believed emperor protected heaven's order. Under Qing decline, peasants believed rulers failed heaven and deserved removal. That transformation shows evolution of civic consciousness. Women's identity shifted from confined domestic role to public activism. After Qing fall, female identity linked to education, careers, and modern fashion. Religious identity also diversified. Christianity, Islam, Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and folk religion coexisted dynamically. Thus, identity across collapse was not destruction, it was expansion. The meaning of Chinese became bigger. More ethnic groups, more languages, more beliefs, more occupations, more social classes. As we arrive at the final stage of this monumental historical journey, it becomes clear that the Ming-Qing collapse cannot be explained by a single cause. It was not simply corruption, peasant uprising, foreign invasion, or economic crisis that brought these dynasties down. Rather, the collapse was a convergence of dozens of forces over centuries. The depth and complexity of this story make the Ming-Qing transition one of the most important chapters in world history. Through these past 19 parts, we have traced how military decay, demographic pressure, climate change, fiscal breakdown, ideological rigidity, foreign intrusion, internal fragmentation, sectional identity, and philosophical transformation shaped China's path. We have studied emperor personalities, court factionalism, merchant expansion, intellectual renewal, and cultural imagination. Now, to complete the picture, we must summarize what these collapses ultimately mean for civilization. The Ming Dynasty began with a sense of rebirth after Mongol domination. Its founder, Zhu Yuanzhang, rose from peasant life, a symbol that Chinese dynastic rebirth came from people rather than aristocracy. His new system replaced the Mongol imperial structure with Confucian bureaucracy, military households, and agricultural economic foundations. Yet the very strength of Ming ideology, agrarian moralism, eventually became weakness. As China urbanized, global trade expanded, and maritime commerce opened horizons, the Ming court refused to evolve. Political institutions remained inward-looking, suspicious of merchants, fearful of military autonomy, and convinced that virtue was stronger than technology. This belief made sense in 1400, but became fatal in 1600. The fall of the Ming revealed a truth repeated across civilizations. States die when they cannot imagine new futures. The Ming failed to imagine a world where foreign silver powered domestic economy, where firearms changed military norms, where climate anomalies disrupted crop cycles, where peasants organized into rebellion communities, and where new ethnic powers like the Manchus rose on the frontier. Its leaders clung to memory rather than adaptation. But collapse did not destroy China. The Qing dynasty built a new order so successful that it expanded Chinese territory to its greatest historical size, ruled nearly 300 years, and established multi-ethnic empire bureaucracy. The Qing brought Mongols into banner ranks, Tibetans into spiritual alliance, and Hui merchants into networks of trust. They implemented civil examinations, balanced Confucian ideology with Manchu militarism, and integrated Buddhist legitimacy. Under Kangxi, Yuanzhang, and Qianlong, the Qing achieved remarkable prosperity. Cities flourished, literacy expanded, bureaucracy stabilized, and culture reached new heights. Yet Qing's success contained seeds of disaster. Population growth, though sign of prosperity, created unbearable pressure on land. Bureaucratic stability ossified into inflexibility. Banner privilege undermined military effectiveness. Confucian orthodoxy blocked scientific adaptation. Ideological pride prevented engagement with Western industrialization. When foreign gunboats arrived, they shattered imperial illusions. The Opium Wars destroyed Qing prestige. The Sino-Japanese War destroyed Confucian worldview. The Boxer War destroyed imperial military credibility. The 1911 revolution destroyed monarchy itself. Even so, collapse was not annihilation. Qing territorial structure remained foundation of modern Chinese borders. Qing multi-ethnic imperial identity survived in concept of national unity. Qing bureaucratic habits shaped modern state administration. Thus, the Ming Qing collapse shows continuity stronger than destruction. Dynasties fell, but civilization adapted. Chinese culture did not vanish like ancient Mesopotamia or Maya kingdoms. Instead, it evolved from agrarian empire to industrial nation-state. The final lesson of Segment 1 is this: collapse is not a death sentence. It is a political transformation shaped by historical necessity. The legacy of the Ming and Qing collapse reaches far beyond academic interest. It actively shapes modern China's worldview, foreign policy, internal governance, educational curriculum, national propaganda, and cultural psychology. The government today consciously studies Ming and Qing history because both dynasties provide strategic lessons on how empires rise, survive, and fail. Modern Chinese leaders frequently reference the Ming as example of stagnation and internal rot. They emphasize how corruption, factionalism, court isolation from ordinary people, and military decay cause collapse. The Ming serves as moral warning. States must maintain meritocracy and accountability. Similarly, the Qing functions as strategic warning about foreign invasion, industrial weakness, and technology gap. Chinese school textbooks highlight how China fell behind West because Qing resisted modernization. These narratives shape China's modern belief that industrial strength and technological innovation are essential to national security. The Ming-Qing collapse also shaped modern nationalism. Revolutionary thinkers used the fall of Qing to justify creation of republic. They portrayed Manchu rulers as foreign oppressors to mobilize mass participation. After 1949, the Communist Party reframed Qing legacy. Instead of foreign oppressors, they became builders of unified Chinese territory. Today's China claims borders identical to Qing Empire. This historical inheritance explains why China emphasizes unity over regional autonomy and why issues involving Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan carry deep emotional weight. Modern sovereignty ideas originate directly from Qing legacy. Economically, the Ming-Qing collapse influenced China's belief in self-strengthening. The government recognizes that isolation caused Qing decline. Therefore, China now pursues global trade dominance. The Ming maritime retreat is remembered as lost opportunity. Today, China invests in Belt and Road Initiative to avoid repeating historical contraction. Militarily, Qing defeat by industrial West reinforced today's drive for modern national defense. The Chinese Navy's humiliation against Britain convinced later generations to never again allow foreign fleets to dominate Asian waters. The People's Liberation Army is built consciously to avoid banner-style privilege and ossification. Officers rotate positions to maintain efficiency, echoing lesson of banner decline. Socially, the Qing collapse shaped modern awareness of peasant power. Both Ming and Qing fell because peasant uprisings shattered imperial rule. The Communist Party, built on peasant mobilization, interprets this history as validation of mass political participation. Rural stability remains national priority because leaders know unrest toppled dynasties before. Philosophically, Ming scholars like Wang Yangming inspired modern pedagogy, focused on critical thinking over memorization. Qing reformists inspired modern law and constitutional debates. Mao cited Qing weakness to legitimize revolutionary ideology. Deng Xiaoping studied Qing industrial delay to justify market reform. Xi Jinping references Qing centralization to emphasize state unity. Culturally, Ming and Qing collapse affects identity narratives. The Ming fuels cultural pride. Porcelain, literature, architecture, and theater remain symbols of golden heritage. The Qing fuels multicultural identity. Manchu cuisine, Mongol culture, Tibetan ritual, and Uyghur history integrate into national mosaic. Psychologically, collapse memory generates caution. Modern China fears repeating past humiliation, shaping diplomatic assertiveness. The narrative, "Never forget national humiliation," originates from late Qing trauma and continues to inform foreign policy. Internationally, historians analyze Ming Qing collapse to understand why Asia industrialized later than Europe. Some argue Confucianism blocked scientific revolution. Others claim geography and environment matter more. Modern Chinese intellectuals reject narrative of cultural inferiority and argue Qing collapse resulted from external aggression rather than internal backwardness. Ultimately, the modern significance of this collapse lies in its demonstration that China can regenerate endlessly. Despite losing empire, monarchy, and world status, China rebuilt into modern global superpower. This resilience fuels today's national confidence. Collapse did not break China. It forged stronger identity. The Ming Qing collapse is more than Chinese history. It is universal human history. When examined deeply, this story teaches lessons about statecraft, human psychology, social evolution, and global destiny. These plants grew on marginal land, feeding millions. Population expanded because of them. Villages spread into hillsides and new valleys. Transportation changed. The Grand Canal system improved communication between northern and southern China. River boats carrying grain, salt, and passengers became common. Inns, guild halls, and merchant networks grew. Markets flourished in Suzhou, Hangzhou, Guangzhou, and Wuhan. Clothing reflected cultural fusion. Han Chinese maintained Confucian robe designs, but Manchu elements influenced fashion, like horsehoof cuffs and coat toggles. Marriage customs varied widely. In rural China, arranged marriages dominated. Bride price transactions shaped negotiation, and clan alliances determined social structure. Qing law codified more rights for widows than Ming law allowed, partly because Manchu society valued women differently. Religious practice remained diverse. Confucian ancestor worship, Taoist ritual, Buddhist temples, and local gods defined spiritual life. Yet Qing rule added Lamuist Buddhism influence through Mongolian and Tibetan connections. In coastal regions, Christianity appeared through missionaries, reshaping family practices. Education changed life expectations. More families sent sons to village schools, hoping exam success could lift family status. Literacy expanded slowly but steadily. News sheets circulated political rumors and poetry, but not all progress signaled improvement. As population increased, farmland per family shrank. Many peasants became landless tenants. Labor exploitation hardened. Lineage property rules protected elite families while trapping poor households in debt. Economic inequality widened. During wars, Taiping, Nian, Muslim uprisings, entire populations fled. Cities burned, fields emptied, and villages disappeared. Millions became refugees, walking hundreds of miles searching for safety. In treaty port cities like Shanghai and Tianjin, everyday life looked shockingly modern by the late Qing. Western clothing, trolley cars, electric lamps, newspapers, cinemas, and industrial factories appeared alongside traditional markets. Foreign districts offer hospitals, schools, and police forces. Yet rural China, home to the majority, remained pre-modern. Wooden houses, hand pumps, folk medicine, and farming tools unchanged for centuries. The everyday Ming Qing transition thus represented uneven transformation. Some gained wealth and literacy, while many faced hunger, fear, and displacement. The dynasty did not fall because one emperor failed, but because millions of ordinary people stopped believing it protected them. The psychology of collapse is one of the most fascinating and haunting features of Ming and Qing history. Societies rarely fall without warning. Instead, people experience gradual emotional withdrawals, loss of trust, loss of meaning, loss of hope. In both dynasties, ordinary citizens, soldiers, scholars, and bureaucrats sensed deterioration decades before armies breached capital walls. Their reactions reveal how political systems unravel from inside. In late Ming society, cynicism replaced unity. Scholar officials who once served government honorably began writing satirical essays mocking court politics. Diaries recorded despair. Officials complained that moral governance no longer mattered, that policy was impossible because corruption choked every channel, and that emperors ignored truth. The Wanli Emperor refused to meet ministers for years, leaving government direction paralyzed. This emotional abandonment destroyed belief in leadership more deeply than any external attack could. Peasants, too, felt betrayal. They saw officials demand impossible taxes while granaries rotted and elite mansions grew larger. Villagers whispered that heaven had cursed the dynasty. Rumors spread easily through markets and temples. When temples began predicting cosmic disaster, many believed them. Fear turned into prophecy. By the 1630s and 1640s, poetry reflected ruin. Writers described cities darkened by smoke and corpses lying unburied along roads. Li Zicheng's rebels wrote songs promising justice, portraying the Qing and Ming elites as tyrants who starved children. The Ming could not counter these narratives because their ideology had lost emotional connection to the people. The Qing decline revealed similar psychology. After 1800, Chinese social consciousness shifted from imperial pride to humiliation. Defeat by Britain broke belief in cultural superiority. Watching foreign troops roam Chinese ports shattered mental worlds. When the Summer Palace burned, people internalized shame. When Japan won the Sino-Japanese War, humiliation deepened further. China's younger brother had surpassed it. Psychologically, this defeat was devastating. Intellectual journals from the late Qing show growing existential terror. Writers feared that China might disintegrate entirely, carved apart by foreign powers like Africa had been. Some elites drowned their despair in opium. Others abandoned monarchy and embraced revolution. Students wrote that China must cut the old self away. Religious psychology also changed. Secret societies promised salvation. Taiping ideology created a theological alternative to Confucianism when people lost faith. Christian imagery merged with Chinese apocalyptic tradition to produce revolutionary zeal. In everyday emotion, late Qing collapse was a story of exhaustion. People had endured wars, taxes, plague, famine, and foreign invasion. They no longer believed emperors protected them. Soldiers deserted because army wages could not feed families. Officials demanded bribes because salaries were useless against inflation. The state no longer functioned emotionally or practically. When the dynasty finally fell in 1911, many people reacted not with grief, but with relief. Memoirs describe citizens cheering, lighting fireworks, and celebrating the Republic, even though they barely understood what a republic meant. The emotional message was clear. Monarchy had spiritually died long before He lost his throne. In both Ming and Qing collapses, cultural brilliance existed alongside emotional decay. Poetry, novels, opera, and art thrive during crisis because creative expression becomes powerful when societies question meaning itself. Historians today view late Ming and late Qing culture not only as artistic achievement, but as psychological documents of civilizational anxiety. To understand the historical transformation between the Ming and Qing dynasties, we must examine the deep political patterns that shaped imperial China over centuries. The rise and fall of dynasties did not happen randomly. They followed recognizable cycles influenced by governance quality, resource management, ideology, military strength, and international environment. The Ming and Qing cycles reveal how political decisions can shape destiny, how empires defeat themselves through strategic blindness, and how choices made in moments of confidence create vulnerabilities that surface centuries later. The Ming Dynasty began with centralized control. Zhu Yuanzhang distrusted aristocracy and dismantled military governors. He believed that giving local generals independent power would lead to rebellion. Therefore, he abolished the Yuan aristocratic system and concentrated authority in Beijing. This decision preserved unity early on, but created a rigid bureaucracy that could not adapt later. When external threats arose and internal rebellions erupted, provincial officials lacked autonomous leadership experience and military independence. As we close this monumental 2-hour narrative, we must summarize the grand meaning of everything explored. First, this history shows that no empire is invincible. The Ming believed moral purity would protect their rule. The Qing believed military banners would preserve their dynasty. Both beliefs proved false. Empires fall when they cling to outdated systems. Survival requires constant transformation. Human societies everywhere must learn to adapt or perish. Second, the collapse illustrates how environment shapes history. Climate change, drought, earthquakes, and famine contributed to rebellion. Today, climate change threatens the world again. Ming and Qing disasters remind us. Ecological instability destabilizes civilization. Food shortages can trigger war faster than ideology. Nations that ignore environmental signals repeat imperial mistakes. Third, the collapse reveals how ideas shape destiny. Confucian orthodoxy sustained imperial unity for centuries, yet later suffocated innovation. But new intellectual movements, Wang Yangming philosophy, nationalism, socialism, rebuilt China through ideological renewal. History warns against intellectual stagnation. Knowledge must evolve. Fourth, this history proves that ordinary people decide the fate of states. Peasants armed with desperation overthrew both dynasties. Rulers who forget the masses lose power. Every stable society relies on economic fairness, justice, and representation. Fifth, collapse shows that multicultural empires must balance diversity and identity. The Qing succeeded because they integrated ethnic groups, but failure to modernize multicultural system led to nationalist revolt. Modern global societies face same challenge: how to unify diversity without erasing identity. Sixth, collapse displays how globalization reshapes states. Ming rejection of maritime trade caused economic stagnation. Qing resistance to industrial technology enabled Western domination. The very centralization that protected early Ming stability caused paralysis in the end. Similarly, the Qing dynasty pursued centralization in its early period, but their methods differed. They used banners to maintain military discipline and imperial clans to check political rivalries. However, centralization during the Qing Golden Age removed incentives for reform. When governance ran smoothly under Kangxi Qianlong, officials assumed the system was perfect. This complacency prevented adaptation to new problems: industrialization abroad, population explosion at home, and global capitalism. Thus, when crisis hit in the 19th century, Qing rulers responded with outdated strategies. Another political pattern involves the use of ideology. Both dynasties believed Confucian ethics guaranteed political stability. But Confucian ethics made innovation difficult because maintaining tradition was prioritized over experimentation. The Ming refused to modernize naval exploration after Zheng He because leaders feared maritime trade would empower merchants and weaken agrarian taxation. The Qing refused to industrialize because leaders feared foreign technology would corrupt moral values. Ideology became a cage. Institutional rigidity also emerges in surveillance and censorship systems. Both Ming and Qing governments used secret police networks to monitor officials. Under the Ming, the East Factory and Jinhui suppressed dissent. Under the Qing, the Literary Inquisition punished ideological deviation. These systems prevented rebellion at first, but they stifled intellectual creativity. When crisis required innovative thinking, educated elites feared proposing radical solutions. They learned to survive, not to transform. Fiscal structure represents another shared weakness. Both empires relied on land taxes as their primary revenue source. This made sense in an agrarian era, but became disastrous when population quadrupled and commercial trade expanded. The government did not redesign tax networks to follow changing economy. As a result, merchants became wealthy without contributing proportionally to state revenue, while peasants bore unbearable burdens. Foreign relations further reveal structural parallels. The Ming, confident in continental superiority, rejected diplomatic engagement with European powers. The Qing, inheriting tributary worldview, also dismissed Western norms. When Europe transformed geopolitics through maritime trade and industrialization, China remained ideologically isolated. This isolation delayed modern reforms. Finally, both empires underestimated psychological warfare. Public belief mattered more than tax data or troop numbers. When people believed the dynasty had heaven's mandate, society tolerated hardship. When people believed the dynasty had lost heaven's favor, rebellion spread effortlessly. Prophecy, rumor, and gossip often determined political fate more than imperial edicts. These patterns highlight a fundamental truth. The same forces that build empires eventually destroy them if adaptation stops. Early Ming's strength created later vulnerability. Early Qing's strength hid structural weakness. Institutional decisions taken by the Ming and Qing governments deeply influenced Chinese history. These were not random choices. They reflected worldviews shaped by geography, economy, and political memory. By comparing key decisions, we can understand why Ming institutions decayed and why Qing institutions endured for nearly 3 centuries before collapsing under modern pressures. One major difference was how each dynasty used hereditary social structures. The Ming military household system forced soldiers into hereditary military service. On paper, this system provided a permanent army with farming-based self-support. In reality, it froze military skill, removed incentive to excel, and made the army vulnerable to corruption. Over generations, military households lost combat ability, paying taxes instead of serving. Meanwhile, the Qing banner system, also hereditary, remained effective longer because it integrated identity and honor. Banner soldiers trained constantly and enjoyed elite status. However, the Qing banner system eventually fell into similar stagnation. Once military stipends became entitlements rather than rewards for performance, banners turned financially parasitic. Soldiers depended on state funds rather than training, just as Ming troops once depended on agriculture. Institutional decay is not a failure of design alone. It is a failure to adapt the design to changing realities. Another institutional decision involved exam culture. The Ming perfected the civil service exam as a meritocratic tool. It produced capable ministers and stabilized government by replacing aristocracy. However, this exam structure became rigid. Students studied commentaries instead of practical science. The Qing continued the system unquestioned until the 20th century, even as Japan and Europe modernized through science-based education. Decisions regarding economic control also had consequences. Ming rulers distrusted maritime trade, closing ports periodically and banning private overseas voyages. They feared merchants would accumulate political influence. This decision cut China out of global commerce precisely when European empires expanded. The Qing, more open to trade, embraced Canton system commerce. But when foreign traders demanded wider access, the Qing hesitated, leading to war rather than mutual reform. Infrastructure maintenance also shaped destiny. The Ming neglected the Grand Canal in its final century, disrupting grain supply. Grain transport breakdown directly fueled rebellion in northern China. The Qing, learning from that failure, devoted enormous resources to canal repair, especially under Kangxi and Qianlong. However, by the 19th century, river sedimentation and technological stagnation made canal-based transport obsolete. Without railways, the Qing economy could not compete militarily. Social mobility choices mattered as well. The Ming invited scholar families from across China to participate in government. This produced broad national loyalty. The Qing preserved exams, but Manchu elites blocked high office appointments, shrinking opportunity for Han scholars and creating resentment. Foreign inclusion also differentiated outcomes. The Ming distrusted border peoples and pushed for cultural assimilation. The Qing, coming from a multi-ethnic background, adapted foreign peoples into governance. Mongols gained banner leadership. Tibetans retained lamas. Muslims were governed through native administrators. This flexible inclusion expanded empire boundaries. Yet this flexibility weakened by the 19th century. As nationalism developed, the Qing multi-ethnic identity conflicted with rising Han ethnocentrism. Revolutionaries used ethnicity as weapon, calling the Qing foreign occupiers, undermining loyalty. Institutional crisis after 1850 accelerated collapse. The Qing lost control of military decentralization during Taiping Rebellion. Regional armies, once emergency tools, became permanent powers. Zheng He and Li Zicheng saved the dynasty militarily, yet destroyed it administratively. Their armies overshadowed imperial authority. After their deaths, successors like Yuan Shikai used military power to dominate politics. Precedents set by Qing decisions shaped modern China. Regional warlordism, authoritarian leadership necessity, state-led economic planning, suspicion toward decentralization, emphasis on national unity. These patterns echo modern Chinese governance, showing how institutional history influences present. The Ming and Qing collapse reshaped world history far beyond China's borders. Many global developments, industrial expansion, colonialism, modern warfare, and international diplomacy, were influenced by China's transformation from self-contained empire to semi-colonized state, then to modern nation. Understanding these impacts reveals how the fall of Chinese dynasties reshaped Asia, Europe, and global power systems. When the Ming prohibited maritime expansion, Europe gained uncontested oceanic dominance. Zheng He's voyages had demonstrated Chinese naval capacity, but the Ming court, fearing cost and social disruption, withdrew from the sea. As a result, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and Britain dominated global trade routes. If China had continued maritime exploration, world history might look radically different. Southeast Asia might have become Sino-influenced rather than Euro-colonized. The Indian Ocean might have become a Chinese economic sphere. Global trade might have flowed through Guangzhou instead of Amsterdam. The Qing rise stabilized the Eurasian interior. Their conquest of Mongolia and suppression of the Dzungars transformed Central Asia. Without the Qing, Russia might have expanded southward sooner. Qing control delayed Russian influence until the 19th century, shaping Siberia's settlement pattern. Qing tributary diplomacy influenced Japan and Korea. Early Qing success encouraged Korean aristocrats to adopt Qing-style clothing and calendar reforms. Japan, however, rejected Qing authority, fueling identity formation that later inspired Meiji nationalism. Observing China's humiliation during the Opium Wars, Japan decided to modernize rapidly to avoid similar fate. Europe used Qing weakness to expand imperial ideology. The Opium War victory convinced Western nations that industrial power guaranteed domination. Gunboat diplomacy became global strategy, applied in Egypt, Latin America, and the Ottoman Empire. Meanwhile, missionary expansion in China shaped global Christianity, transforming it into universal religion. The 19th century Chinese diaspora, triggered by Qing instability, altered American and Southeast Asian societies. Chinese immigrants built U.S. railroads, developed Malaysian tin mines, and created Singapore's merchant class. These migrations reshaped global labor networks. China's collapse also affected global political thought. Karl Marx studied Taiping documents, interpreting the rebellion as early communist expression. Western intellectuals debated whether China proved that civilization stagnates without capitalism. In the 20th century, Qing collapse inspired Asian nationalism. Vietnamese independence leaders studied Qing defeat as evidence that colonialism could be resisted through modernization. Indian thinkers observed China's Republican Revolution as example of traditional empires overthrowing monarchy. Today, modern geopolitics reflect Qing legacy. China claims South China Sea islands based on historical Qing maps. Taiwan's political status traces back to Qing rule. Mongolia's independence stems from Qing disintegration. Thus, Ming and Qing collapses were not just Chinese tragedies. They were global turning points. World industrial leadership shifted toward the West because China slowed development. Asian modernization models emerged partly in response to Qing humiliation. Although historians often highlight political corruption or foreign invasion when explaining the fall of the Ming and Qing dynasties, deeper forces shaped these endings over centuries. Economics, demographics, environment, and structural resource pressure. Societies don't collapse just because rulers make bad decisions. They collapse when internal capacity fails to match external and internal demands. The Ming Qing story offers a powerful case study in how long-term structural dynamics determine imperial survival. One major structural factor was demographic expansion. The population of China under the Ming began around 60 million. By the Qing peak in the early 19th century, the population had exceeded 400 million. This staggering growth transformed society. While early Qing agricultural reforms improved flood control and New World crops like maize and sweet potatoes expanded food supply, they could not keep pace with exponential population growth. Eventually, land per person shrank drastically. Small farms became microplots incapable of feeding families. In many regions, 2 or 3 generations shared harvests from fields once sufficient for one. Population growth also produced labor oversupply. Underemployment rose sharply. Young men, unable to find farmland, drifted to cities seeking wage labor, becoming vulnerable to famine and instability. Brigandage and banditry flourished. These landless populations later became recruits for rebellion movements like the Taiping and Yan uprisings. Demographic density aligned perfectly with political upheaval. The demographic boom changed gender patterns. In many rural areas, female infanticide increased, causing gender imbalance. Marriage prospects deteriorated. Massive numbers of young men remained unmarried, statistically increasing risk of rebellion. These demographic imbalances reflected long-term instability invisible at state level, but clear in village experience. Economic structure also contributed to collapse. China's wealth distribution under both Ming and Qing remained skewed toward landed elites. 90% of people lived in rural society. Industrial wages did not exist for most. Landlords accumulated wealth through tenancy rents. Tenants, burdened by taxes and rent, possessed little economic security. This exploitative model worked during stable periods, but failed under crisis. By comparison, Europe industrialized in the 18th and 19th centuries, creating urban wages, capital markets, and mechanized output. China, trapped in agrarian structure, remained vulnerable to famine cycles. The Qing state collected land taxes instead of income or commercial taxes, meaning government revenue never grew proportionally to population. As a result, despite 400 million citizens, the imperial treasury held smaller reserves than many European states. Environmental pressures added further strain. China depended on major river systems, the Yangtze, Yellow, Huai, for agricultural irrigation and flood management. During late Ming and Qing periods, climate cooling from the Little Ice Age altered rainfall patterns. Harvest failures increased. The Yellow River changed course multiple times, devastating farmland. Flooding in one region triggered tax shortfalls, causing military inadequacy in another. Resource scarcity fueled deforestation. Hillsides near population centers were stripped for fuel and construction, worsening soil erosion and flooding. Rural families cut forests to expand farmland, degrading ecological stability. Government attempts to control logging came too late. Silver dependency deepened vulnerability. Ming and Qing economies used silver currency for taxation and commercial exchange. For years, silver from Spanish America flowed into China through Manila galleons, supporting booming trade. But when global silver availability declined in the 17th century, tax systems collapsed. In late Ming period, silver shortage caused grain taxes to spike. Peasants revolted because state demands exceeded economic capacity. Similarly, in the 19th century, opium trade drained silver from China, weakening Qing currency and destroying purchasing power. trade imbalance magnified vulnerability. European powers imported tea, porcelain, and silk, but China imported few Western goods. When opium replaced silver, state revenue diverged from capital circulation. British merchants profited massively, while Chinese peasants bore addiction costs. Another structural factor was technology stagnation. While the Qing admired and used firearms early in conquest, later governments rejected industrial steel foundries, mechanical looms, and mass production arsenals. China fell behind economically because state ideology favored small workshops over mechanized factories. Europe harnessed steam power. China relied on water wheels and manual spinning. Failure to industrialize meant China lacked railroads and telegraphs until foreign nations forced concessions. When famine struck, slow transport prevented food redistribution. When rebellions erupted, slow troop movement allowed uprisings to spread. Economically, the Qing court underestimated capitalist forces reshaping the world. Europe converted manufacturing surplus into gunboat navies and colonial empire. China remained agrarian and static. All these structural realities created vulnerability long before warfare erupted. Political corruption didn't cause collapse. It accelerated inevitable pressure already built from demographic, environmental, and economic imbalance. Economic decline sits at the center of both Ming and Qing collapses. When we look beyond dynastic chronicles and examine data patterns, grain distribution, silver supply, tax quotas, labor cost, we see collapse not as random tragedy, but as predictable outcome. Economies behave like ecosystems. When supply chains weaken, when currency fails, when consumption networks shrink, collapse accelerates. During the Ming, fiscal erosion began with corruption and ended with structural failure. Local officials often falsified tax records to enrich themselves. The state then raised quotas, harming peasants rather than punishing officials. Inflation developed when government minted copper coins without backing metal reserves. At the same time, maritime trade restrictions prevented wealth diversification. Consequently, by the 1620s, state granaries were empty, and officials could not send grain relief to northern regions where droughts devastated agriculture. Most Ming emperors lived in a symbolic economy, measuring success through Confucian ritual rather than financial analysis. Investment in canal maintenance declined. Military wage arrears grew. Agricultural productivity stagnated. When silver imports declined in the 1630s due to Spanish crises and Japanese isolationism, the Ming treasury crumbled. Peasants rebelled because the economy broke first, not because ideology changed. The Qing initially reversed decline. Early emperors implemented tax relief, expanded land registration, and created massive reserves. Yuanzhang streamlined fiscal administration and reduced corruption. Qianlong expanded territory, increasing taxable land. These successes built prosperity, but also complacency. By the 19th century, fiscal crisis resurfaced. The Qing couldn't modernize revenue systems to fund industrial infrastructure. Land taxes remained the main income source. Inflation rose as population increased. Deficit spending soared during rebellions. Taiping and Yin uprisings destroyed regional tax bases for decades. Foreign trade shifted financial power away from state control. Merchants in Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Tianjin generated wealth independent from imperial administration. Western banks dominated tariff collection through the Maritime Customs Service. The Opium War triggered currency divergence. As silver flowed outward to buy opium, silver to copper ratio destabilized. Everyday transactions broke down. Farmers couldn't pay taxes because exchange rates fluctuated wildly. Inflation and famine surged in the countryside. Food distribution networks also decayed. China produced enough food in theory, but lacked logistics to move grain efficiently between provinces. Today, global exchange again determines power. Nations that isolate themselves risk backwardness. Seventh, the Ming Qing transition represents philosophical maturity. It forced Chinese thinkers to abandon belief that heaven guarantees justice. Instead, they learned that history is human-made. This intellectual shift paved way for constitutionalism, republicanism, communism, and modern pragmatism. Eighth, this collapse shaped world history. Without Qing defeat, Japan might not have modernized. Without Qing disintegration, European imperialism in Asia might have slowed. Without Ming memory, Chinese nationalism might not exist. Ninth, this history reveals humanity's emotional depth. Diaries, poetry, novels, and paintings show fear, hope, love, grief, loyalty, betrayal. Universal human experience. Through these voices, dynastic collapse becomes human story rather than abstract timeline. Finally, the most profound lesson. Civilizations survive when their cultural foundations endure. China preserved writing, family structure, philosophical tradition, and collective identity. Empires fell, yet China remained. This continuity makes Chinese history one of most extraordinary examples of civilizational resilience. The Ming Qing collapse reminds us that endings are beginnings. Ming death created Qing birth. Qing death created modern China. Collapse is transformation, not disappearance. Large harvests in Sichuan could not easily reach hungry regions in Hunan or Shaanxi. Railroads did not exist. Canals silt blocked transport. Fiscal authority fragmented further during self-strengthening movement. Provincial leaders reallocated tax revenue to regional army upkeep rather than imperial treasury. The Qing court lost budgetary power. The most devastating long-term fiscal blow came after Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895. Qing indemnity payments to Japan drained gold and silver reserves, forcing heavy foreign loans. Interest payments alone exceeded national education and military budgets combined. The Qing economy became debt-dependent, a cycle impossible to escape without radical reform. Meanwhile, industrial competition destroyed traditional crafts. British machine-woven textiles undercut Chinese handloom prices. Silk exports collapsed as European factories replicated production. Chinese merchants resisted mechanization to protect guild interests, worsening decline. The Qing reformers attempted industrial investment, arsenals, telegraph companies, shipyards, but corruption siphoned profits. Without national banking system, modern capital markets never developed. Peasants felt economic pain most intensely. Rising taxes, falling land access, opium addiction, famine, and wage stagnation produced despair. People starved quietly first, then rebelled. Economic collapse precedes political collapse almost universally. One of the most striking features of Ming and Qing decline is that both faced nearly identical external and internal pressures, but responded differently, leading to different timelines of collapse. Comparing how each dynasty handled crisis reveals why Ming fell quickly, while Qing lingered for decades after terminal decline began. Environmental catastrophe struck both dynasties. The Ming faced the Little Ice Age during its final century. Temperatures dropped, monsoons weakened, harvests failed. Drought in Shaanxi destroyed government revenue, triggering Li Zicheng's rebellion. The Qing faced environmental disasters too. Yellow River floods in 1855 killed thousands. Droughts in North China in late 19th century produced mass famine. Yet the Qing managed to survive severe disasters longer because their early rulers invested heavily in river conservancy. Under Kangxi and Qianlong, flood control institutions functioned. Under the Ming, mismanagement allowed the Yellow River to alter course catastrophically. Demographic pressure differs sharply. While Ming population peaked around 150 million, the Qing quadrupled that total. Managing 400 million people required more efficient bureaucracy than imperial China possessed. That the Qing survived so long under such demographic pressure is remarkable. But increasing population meant more peasants fighting over shrinking farmland. This reality fueled Taiping appeal. Hong Xiuquan promised land redistribution because villagers urgently needed it. global economic shock also differed. The Ming collapse coincided with silver contraction. The Qing collapse coincided with opium currency drain and Western industrial dominance. Ming leaders had no chance to respond to global capitalism because it did not yet exist. The Qing did, but chose to ignore modernization. Foreign invasion pressures diverged as well. The Ming faced Manchu Conquest at moment of internal rebellion. The Qing faced European powers while already weakened by internal revolt. The Ming fell swiftly because rebels and invaders timed perfectly. The Qing endured longer because enemies arrived sequentially, not simultaneously, allowing temporary stabilization between crises. Cultural and ideological structures, however, followed eerily similar patterns. Both dynasties produced brilliant literature near collapse because crisis inspires introspection. Both dynasties experienced factionalism, censorship, and bureaucratic immobilization. Both dynasties believed they embodied moral correctness even while society disintegrated around them. But Qing had one advantage: multi-ethnic worldview. By adopting Mongols, Tibetans, and Uyghurs into its imperial order, the Qing delayed ethnic fracture. The Ming, being more ethnically rigid, alienated frontier peoples earlier. However, multi-ethnic empire brought new weakness. When nationalism swept China in the 20th century, Manchu identity became liability. Revolutionaries cast Qing as foreign oppressors, destroying their legitimacy. Ultimately, the Ming and Qing collapsed for the same core reason. Institutional adaptation lagged behind structural pressure. Empires built for agrarian economies could not survive industrial reality. Once gunpowder empires faced steam-powered empires, collapse became inevitable. Both dynasties illustrate universal lessons. Societies must adjust to external world. Technology determines military power. Economy determines army strength. People support governments that meet needs. Ideology must adapt or perish. Dynastic collapse does not end when the last emperor is dethroned. It continues to live in cultural memory, shaping how future generations interpret identity, legitimacy, nationalism, and meaning itself. The fall of the Ming Dynasty did not disappear in 1644. It survived deep within Qing consciousness, literature, theater, folklore, and intellectual discourse. Likewise, the fall of the Qing Dynasty did not end in 1912. It rippled through the Republican era, the Communist Revolution, and even contemporary China. To understand these transitions, we must analyze nostalgia and memory as active historical forces. Ming nostalgia was particularly strong during early Qing rule. Many Han scholars who surrendered to Qing authority secretly mourned the Ming state. Some refused to serve the new dynasty, choosing suicide over official appointment. Others became emin, men of integrity who lived in retirement, symbolically preserving loyalty to the lost Ming. Their writings expressed emotional torment. Loyalty to cultural Confucian values was now separated from political obedience. For the first time in centuries, being Chinese did not automatically mean loyalty to the ruling dynasty. Literature reflected this emotional fracture. One of the most famous transformations occurred in theater. Ming loyalists used plays to express indirect criticism. Actors performed stories of ancient kings betrayed by usurpers or loyal servants dying in vain defense of their lords. Audiences understood these metaphors as references to Qing conquest. Authorities responded with censorship, but art transcended suppression. Poetry became even more powerful. Late Ming poets wrote of crumbling cities, burned palaces, ruined gardens, and cherry blossoms falling like loyalist tears. Their poems used nature symbolism to mask political meaning. The most vivid images portrayed the Ming capital Beijing as a ghost city haunted by memory. Confucian virtues, such as loyalty and filial piety, were tied to Ming remembrance. Losing a dynasty felt to many like losing heaven's guidance. Yet not all memory condemned Qing rule. Some intellectuals, adopting pragmatic Confucian reasoning, argued that the Qing achieved mandate of heaven through victory and effective governance. Writers like Gu Yanwu and Huang Zongxi examined Ming decline critically, believing the collapse represented moral consequences rather than foreign injustice. They used memory not to resist Qing, but to advocate reform. Meanwhile, Qing emperors themselves manipulated Ming memory. Kangxi toured Jiangnan to calm Ming loyalist sentiment, performing Confucian rituals at Ming tombs to legitimize continuity. Qianlong wrote poems honoring Ming loyalists, hoping to prove that the Qing respected Han cultural lineage. The Qing promoted themselves not as conquerors, but inheritors of Chinese civilization. This ideological engineering successfully integrated Ming memory into Qing legitimacy. However, beneath elite literature, oral storytelling kept traumatic memory alive. In rural villages, folk songs describe how Ming soldiers died bravely defending small towns against Manchu troops. In Cantonese opera, heroes sacrificed themselves resisting foreign conquest. In Fujian and Zhejiang provinces, families kept ancestral Ming banners hidden in attics, believing they were treasures representing lost honor. Memory also shaped identity differently across class. For elites, Ming nostalgia expressed political idealism. For peasants, memory expressed economic suffering. Many remember the Ming not as golden age, but as period of famine and taxation. Their loyalty depended less on ancestry and more on food security. If the Qing brought stability, they preferred Qing rule. Over time, memory changed form. By the 18th century, nostalgia became aesthetic rather than political. Painters romanticized Ming landscapes using broken brushstrokes and empty spaces, symbolizing emotional longing without rebellion. Scholars compiled Ming histories with fascination rather than hatred. Drama turned heroic Ming emperors into characters of legend, admired for tragedy rather than political relevance. Then, memory reversed direction. In the late Qing, intellectuals began romanticizing the Ming as heroic Chinese resistance against foreign conquest. Revolutionaries saw Qing as foreign occupiers and revived Ming symbols to fuel nationalism. The Ming became political icon again, not cultural relic. Sun Yat-sen referenced Ming resistance literature to promote anti-Qing revolution. The fall of Qing was shaped partly by Ming memory, finally returning to political function. Thus, nostalgia is not passive emotion, it is historical force. It explains how societies remember rulers, justify revolutions, and rebuild identities after collapse. Chinese literature during the Ming Qing transition did more than mourn a lost dynasty. It redefined emotional and philosophical depth in global literary history. The chaos of dynastic change gave birth to intellectual introspection, psychological realism, and narrative experimentation. This cultural shift can be seen most clearly in novels, poetry, opera, historical writing, and philosophical essays. One of the most important literary breakthroughs came through vernacular novels. Although literature existed long before, the Ming and Qing periods transformed narrative fiction into a central cultural medium. Works like Journey to the West reflected social satire, spiritual allegory, and humor. But during the Qing, the novel evolved further, revealing deep emotional consciousness. The ultimate product of this transition is arguably Dream of the Red Chamber by Chao Shuichen. Written during Qing decline, the novel portrays aristocratic family collapse with extraordinary psychological detail. It allegorizes the fall of an empire and critiques Confucian patriarchy, showing emotional torment caused by rigid hierarchy. This novel is impossible without Qing decline. Its sadness mirrors societal collapse. Similarly, Strange Tales from a Chinese Studio by Pu Songling captured fears of spirits, corrupted officials, unfulfilled desire, and cosmic injustice. Ghost stories became social commentary on bureaucratic cruelty and dynastic anxiety. Theater also evolved dramatically. Ming dramas by Tang Xinzu, especially The Peony Pavilion, explored love as force stronger than social duty. Qing theater intensified character complexity and emotional realism. Beijing opera developed symbolic color systems and vocal tones representing moral archetypes: loyalty, treachery, comedy, patriotism. History writing changed too. The Ming Shirlu, veritable records, presented official narrative, but Qing historiography introduced unprecedented data cataloging. The Siku Quanshu attempted to catalog all Chinese knowledge, although also censored dissenting works. Philosophers confronted collapse with new ideas. Late Ming thinkers like Wang Yangming challenged orthodox Confucianism, insisting knowledge must emerge from personal experience rather than text memorization. His ideas inspired individualism, which later fueled resistance movements. During Qing times, intellectuals like Gu Yanwu and Wang Fuji examined dynastic cycles scientifically. They rejected superstition and studied history to understand systemic failure. They argued moral self-cultivation alone could not save empire. Only structural reform could. Their critique directly influenced modern Chinese nationalism. Western ideas also entered literature. Jesuits translated European astronomy and mathematics into Chinese, reshaping conceptions of universe. Later, missionaries translated Bible passages, giving Chinese writers access to monotheistic imagination. Print capitalism changed literary production. Cheap books flooded markets. Readers expanded beyond elites to merchants, artisans, and even literate women. Reading became public hobby rather than privilege. Women's literature also flourished. Even under patriarchal restrictions, some women wrote poetry, memoirs, and essays describing emotional life. Works by Liu Rushi and Wu Zhao explored female desire, trauma, and autonomy. Meanwhile, literature preserved memory of ordinary life. Eyewitness diaries of Beijing's fall in 1644 describe panic, suicide, and betrayal. Later diaries recorded Boxer siege conditions, famine migrations, and student movements. Philosophically, the Ming-Qing transition questioned Confucian metaphysics. If heaven granted mandate to rulers, why did dynasties fall repeatedly? Why did morality fail to save empire? New thinkers answered, truth comes from social reality, not cosmic righteousness. This intellectual shift weakened divine kingship and enabled modern politics. Western influence later deepened these questions. After the Opium War, writers debated science versus Confucian ritual. Reformers advocated for constitutional monarchy. Radical students embraced socialism, anarchism, and liberal democracy. Thus, literature became battlefield of identity. While politics collapsed, art evolved. Empires fell, but culture advanced. This paradox reveals a universal pattern. Crises stimulate creativity. Philosophical legacy from the Ming. Qing transition continues to influence modern China's intellectual framework. Ideas did not vanish with dynastic collapse. They migrated into nationalism, republicanism, communism, and contemporary ideology. To understand modern China, we must trace how philosophy evolved from Confucian monarchy into revolutionary thinking after Qing fall. One major philosophical shift was transformation of Confucianism. In the Ming, Neo-Confucian orthodoxy dominated education. The civil service exam required memorization of Zhu Yuanzhang's commentaries. This rigid structure discouraged scientific exploration and economic theory. But late Ming philosophers like Wang Yangming broke orthodoxy, arguing inner conscience was source of truth. His teachings encouraged personal responsibility over obedience, a seed that would later feed revolutionary thought. During Qing, Confucianism experienced crisis. The empire preserved examinations, but literati knew classical learning could not solve modern challenges. As military defeats increased, faith in Confucian world order faded. Intellectuals began debating new forms of authority. Qing philosophers like Gu Yanwu denied passive loyalty. He argued people owed allegiance only to legitimate rule, not hereditary monarchy. This idea weakened imperial logic and supported republican development. Ethnic identity also shaped philosophy. Ming loyalists wrote, that only Han rule could maintain moral order. Qing rulers rejected this, promoting multi-ethnic universal empire. But after Sino-Japanese defeat, nationalism swung back to Han identity. Philosophers argued that only national unity could resist imperialism. This ideological transformation birthed Sun Yat-sen's three principles of the people: nationalism, democracy, and livelihood. Economic philosophy changed dramatically. For centuries, Chinese scholars dismissed merchants as socially inferior. Under Qing decline, thinkers like Wang Tao and Liang Qichao argued commerce and industry were essential to survival. They demanded banking, patents, and railroads. Their ideas became blueprint for 20th century growth. Reformist philosophy emerged through exposure to Western science. Yin Fu translated Darwin, Spencer, and Mill into Chinese, transforming worldview. Survival of the fittest became political doctrine. Nations must modernize or die. This philosophy justified abolition of monarchy. Meanwhile, revolutionary philosophy emerged among students who saw corruption and foreign control destroying China. They believed monarchy was unsalvageable. These students later founded Chinese Communist Party. Mao Zedong studied Qing collapse and declared peasants, not elites, must lead revolution. Communist ideology partly emerged as response to Qing mismanagement of rural populations. Modern China retains philosophical DNA from Ming and Qing eras, meritocratic ideology from exam tradition, centralized authority from imperial structure, economic planning from late Qing reform ideas, nationalism from anti-Qing uprisings, multi-ethnic identity from Qing empire boundaries. Even today, Chinese political rhetoric invokes dynastic memory. Leaders warn against corruption by referencing Ming collapse. They justify strong central rule by citing Qing warlord fragmentation. They frame modernization as lesson learned from Qing industrial delay. Thus, Ming and Qing philosophical legacies remain alive not as relics, but as guiding frameworks for modern China's identity. The collapse of the Ming and Qing dynasties becomes even more meaningful when placed beside other great imperial collapses around the world. Human history contains repeated patterns of rise, glory, stagnation, decline, and collapse. When we compare China to Rome, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, Habsburg Spain, Bourbon France, and even the Soviet Union, we discover universal principles shaping imperial destiny. These comparisons allow us to highlight what is unique about Chinese resilience, why the civilization survived even as dynasties fell. Let us begin with Rome. Much like the Qing, Rome ruled over a diverse, multi-ethnic population through central administration and law. It integrated conquered peoples through citizenship, just as Qing integrated Mongols, Tibetans, and Muslims through banners and regional autonomy. Rome collapsed partly because of demographic stress, corruption, foreign invasion, and inability to adapt military power to structural change, parallels to Qing decline. The Visigoths crossing Roman borders resembled British gunboats, forcing open Qing ports. Yet after Western Rome fell, the Roman world shattered into fragments, giving rise to warring medieval kingdoms. China, however, retained cultural continuity even after Ming and Qing collapse. Mandate of heaven ideology, Confucian values, and Chinese language prevented fragmentation into dozens of independent states. The Ottoman Empire shares another striking parallel. Both Qing and Ottoman rulers relied on hereditary military elites, Ottoman janissaries and Qing banner troops. Both systems hardened into privileged castes resistant to modernization. The janissaries opposed Selim III's reforms in 1790s, much like Qing banner aristocrats rejected military modernization. Today, we traveled across nearly 600 years of human struggle and achievement. We saw how the great Ming Dynasty rose from peasant armies and fell to corruption, famine, silver collapse, and rebellion. We witnessed how the Qing Dynasty conquered China, built the largest Chinese empire ever known, and then slowly weakened through population pressure, industrial failure, foreign invasion, and ideological decay. We saw powerful lessons. Fire empires do not fall in a single day. They fall slowly from within. Fire corruption is more dangerous than any enemy. Fire technology and innovation decide survival. Tradition alone cannot protect power. Fire common people, not emperors, decide history. Fire when governments ignore pain of the poor. Rebellions rise like storms. El identity transforms. Ming Han pride. King multiethnic unitu. Modern nationalism. Fire collapse is transformation, not extinction. This entire journey shows that history repeats, and understanding the past protects our future. Today, you experienced a full 20-part documentary covering heavy checkmark politics and war, heavy checkmark culture and philosophy, heavy checkmark economics and climate, heavy checkmark religion, gender, identity, heavy checkmark global comparisons, heavy checkmark and moral lessons for modern nations. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, if it opened new knowledge inside you, then join us again, because History Teller YT is just getting started. More empires are waiting. Rome, Ottoman, Mughal, Japan, Soviet Union, Egypt, Greece. Their rise and fall, their secrets and lessons. So subscribe, return, and continue this journey with us. History does not sleep, and neither do we. See you in the next story. Until then, stay curious, stay questioning, stay passionate. Goodbye. Both empires suffered from overextension and economic dependency on European capitalism. Both proceeded through partial industrialization without full modernization. Yet differences remain. The Ottoman Empire shrank gradually, losing provinces to nationalism. Qing Empire collapsed abruptly, replaced by Republican Revolution, but its territorial structure mostly survived. Modern Turkey is a fraction of Ottoman territory. Modern China occupies nearly all Qing land. The Mughal Empire in India also mirrors Ming collapse. Both empires faced peasant rebellion, revenue breakdown, and regional warlordism. The Mughal Empire disintegrated after Aurangzeb's death as nobles became independent rulers. The Qing faced similar decentralization after Taiping Rebellion, as provincial military leaders gained power. Yet British colonization erased Mughal sovereignty entirely, while China remained only semi-colonized. This difference occurred because Britain took advantage of India's fractured internal geography, whereas China's centralized cultural identity resisted total foreign takeover. The Spanish Empire also reflects Qing lessons. Spain built enormous wealth from silver mines in the Americas, just as Qing economy was silver dependent. When Spanish mines faltered and inflation soared, Spain lost economic power, similar to Ming currency crisis. Both nations also relied heavily on religious ideology. Spain on Catholic orthodoxy, China on Confucian orthodoxy. Orthodoxy slowed innovation in both states. The French monarchy collapsed during Revolution, an event comparable to Qing fall. Louis XVI represented a monarchy unable to reform, resembling Guangxu Emperor. Enlightenment ideas challenged divine rule. Nationalism overthrew aristocracy. In China, republican ideas overthrew monarchy too. But France completed institutional revolution. China entered warlordism instead because democratic structures lacked national cohesion. Even the Soviet Union offers relevant comparison. Like the Qing, the USSR collapsed from ideological stagnation, economic exhaustion, and reform paralysis. Gorbachev's reforms triggered elite fragmentation, just as Qing reforms triggered military fragmentation. Yet Soviet Union dissolved into multiple states. China remained whole. What explains this difference? The answer lies in cultural continuity. Despite dynastic collapse, Chinese identity endured through language, civilizational narrative, and shared philosophical foundations. No matter who ruled, the people identified themselves as part of unified cultural civilization. Nationhood survived even without dynasty. Another key difference lies in geography. China possesses defensible river valleys and fertile plains that encourage unity, whereas Europe and the Middle East are divided by mountains and water routes that encourage fragmentation. Population density contributed too. China's enormous population created interdependence across regions. Separatism was impractical because economies depended on river systems binding the nation. Even religion played a role. Confucianism lacked a single priesthood or church institution that might divide society into rival camps. This ideological cohesion helped China remain unified after dynastic collapse. Thus, when we compare Ming and Qing to world empires, one message becomes clear. Collapse does not equal disappearance. China did not vanish like Rome, nor shrink like Ottomans, nor fragment like USSR. Instead, each collapse produced cultural renewal. The Qing collapse must also be understood through how Chinese elites saw the world in the 19th century. After Opium War shock, Chinese intellectuals began studying the rise and fall of foreign empires, seeking answers in comparison. They asked, why did Britain become industrial superpower? Why did Japan modernize faster? Why did Ottoman Empire stagnate? These comparative questions shaped reform movements and built ideological bridges between Qing legacy and modern Chinese nationalism. Liang Qichao, one of the most influential reformist thinkers, argued that China must transform national consciousness. He studied European history and declared that China lacked a strong concept of citizenship. He believed Europe's strength came from political participation and nationalism. Liang used Ming and Qing collapse to argue that dynastic loyalty must be replaced with national loyalty. Yin Fu translated Western social Darwinism into Chinese, teaching elites that nations compete as organisms. He used Qing defeat to warn that only the strong survive. His writings inspired reformers to adopt constitutional law and education change. Reform movements inside Qing court also used foreign comparison. Officials studied Prussian army organization, British Navy commands, and Japanese Meiji constitutional monarchy. The self-strengthening movement created arsenals, naval academies, telegraph networks, and diplomatic missions. Yet internal conservative resistance blocked full transformation. Japan became greatest foreign mirror. When Qing officials observed Meiji restoration, they realized modernization was possible within Asian culture. Japan had abolished samurai privilege, reformed schools, and industrialized military, while maintaining emperor. Qing reformers hoped to follow a similar path. But while Japan centralized and modernized under unified leadership, China remained stuck between court conservatives and reformists. Foreign comparison also influenced revolutionary strategies. Sun Yat-sen studied French Revolution, American government, and European nationalism. He concluded monarchy must collapse to create strong nation. Unlike Qing elites, he saw foreign success not as cultural threat, but model for change. Communist thinkers later used foreign comparison differently. They studied Russian Revolution and Marxism to argue peasants could overthrow feudal structures. Mao Zedong directly connected Qing corruption to capitalist imperialism, framing revolution as global class struggle. Even conservative Qing thinkers used foreign comparison to defend tradition. They argued that Chinese civilization possessed moral superiority over Europe, citing Ming memory as example of loyalty and virtue. Comparative thinking changed China's worldview permanently. The country began seeing itself not as center of universe, but as participant in global system. Imperial collapse forced realization that world history shaped national destiny. Moreover, Qing collapse influenced world perceptions of empire. Europeans saw Qing weakness as evidence that monarchy could not compete with industrial capitalism. Japanese saw Qing defeat as warning, industrialization necessary. Colonized peoples around world saw Qing humiliation and found inspiration to rebel against empires. The fall of Qing was not domestic tragedy, but global inflection point. It helped end Asian isolation and integrate China into modern world system. China's unique survival after dynastic collapse stands as one of world history's great achievements. Where many civilizations fractured permanently, China rebuilt repeatedly. To understand why, we must analyze cultural, linguistic, geographic, philosophical, and administrative foundations. First, China possessed a unified writing system. Even when dialects varied, written Chinese connected all educated people. This prevented cultural fragmentation. When Ming fell, scholars still shared same written texts under Qing. When Qing fell, republicans still used same written classics to build new identity. No other civilization possessed such enduring linguistic unity over 2,000 years. Second, Confucian philosophy taught loyalty to civilization over loyalty to dynasty. People believed that even if rulers failed, China itself remained sacred. Rome lacked similar ideology. People transferred identity to church or kingdoms after empire fell. China kept identity anchored in civilization rather than government. Third, China always returned to centralized government because geography encouraged unity. Major river systems, Yangtze, Yellow, Pearl, linked regions economically. Mountain ranges protected interior. Farming required cooperation across provinces. Because land fertility distribution was balanced, secession offered little economic advantage. Fourth, Chinese history ritualized collapse. Mandate of heaven doctrine normalized dynastic replacement. People did not see collapse as apocalypse, but regeneration. Citizens accepted new rulers if they restored order. This expectation enabled Qing to succeed Ming. Later, it allowed republic to emerge without civilizational destruction. Fifth, Chinese bureaucracy remained resilient. Civil service exam created merit-based administration capable of functioning through crisis. Even after rebellion shattered regions, literate officials rebuilt infrastructure, courts, and taxation. Sixth, China avoided intense religious fragmentation. Without competing churches, society lacked theological divides that tore apart medieval Europe or Muslim world. Confucianism integrated with Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and folk beliefs without exclusive conflict. Seventh, China balanced cultural pride with practical assimilation. When Mongols conquered China, they were Sinicized. When Manchus conquered China, they adopted Confucian rituals. Conquerors became Chinese. Therefore, empire endured. Eighth, Chinese social networks, clans, guilds, kinship lines provided local stability even when central state collapsed. These microstructures prevented total breakdown. Finally, Chinese identity survived because people believed in future. Qing fall did not end the culture. It encouraged intellectual renewal, leading eventually to communist unification. Thus, collapse strengthened China rather than destroyed it. Each downfall cleared outdated institutions, making room for transformation. To understand the meaning of the Ming and Qing collapses beyond politics and economics, we must analyze how myth, religion, and cultural imagination reshaped the worldview of Chinese people living through centuries of crisis. Dynasties do not simply fail because armies lose battles. They fall when a civilization's belief systems transform. The Ming-Qing transition was profoundly spiritual because it forced people to reinterpret fate, morality, and cosmic order. During the late Ming, religious pluralism flourished. Confucianism remained official ideology, but Taoism, Buddhism, folk religion, Islam, Christianity, and ancestor worship shaped life in ways that went beyond imperial doctrine. Secret societies practiced spiritual mysticism, offering explanations for suffering and hope for redemption. Ordinary people interpreted famine, plague, and rebellion through mythic narrative. If drought struck, villagers sometimes blamed corrupt officials for angering the gods. If armies lost battles, people believed the emperor had lost heaven's blessing. The mandate of heaven concept created cosmic framework for collapse. Unlike European divine right monarchy, mandate of heaven could transfer to a new ruler when old rulers proved unworthy. This belief explained why Ming peasants eventually stopped resisting the Qing. People saw conquest not only as military defeat, but cosmic replacement. The Ming emperor had failed to protect people from starvation and invasion. Therefore, heaven chose the Manchus. Myth intensified this transition. Stories spread that white horses were seen in the sky, or that ominous comets warned of ending eras. Villagers claimed ghosts of dead soldiers cried from abandoned temples. Signs interpreted through folklore gave psychological explanation to chaos. Because crises are frightening, myth helps societies impose order on uncertainty. The Qing victory brought religious reorganization. The court used Confucian principles to legitimate rule, but unlike the Ming, they also used Tibetan Buddhism, particularly among Mongols. Qing emperors claimed divine status within Buddhist cosmology. Their portraits presented Kangxi and Qianlong as universal monarchs blessed by cosmic wisdom. Meanwhile, the state regulated Taoist temples and patronized Confucian shrines. Religious tolerance under early Qing allowed Christian missionaries to gain influence, especially through Jesuits at court. They taught astronomy and mathematics, science entangled with spirituality. Emperor Kangxi respected scientific Christianity, but later rulers grew suspicious. When papal authority challenged Confucian rites, Qing court expelled missionaries. This religious conflict exposed ideological tension between Chinese ritual and Western theology. Popular religion expressed Qing legitimacy through temple festivals and new mythologies. Manchu heroes became protectors of local communities. Meanwhile, gods associated with Ming loyalism faded or transformed into universal deities rather than symbols of resistance. But by the 19th century, religious life shifted again. Social trauma produced new spiritual movements like the White Lotus sect. These underground networks mixed Buddhism with millenarian apocalypse belief, predicting world cleansing. When peasants suffered under economic hardship, they turned to prophets offering salvation, miracle healing, and escape from oppression. The most dramatic religious political hybrid movement was the Taiping Rebellion. Hong Xiuquan created his own Christianity, claiming he was younger brother of Jesus sent to destroy demons. His teachings combined biblical language with Chinese resistance ideology. He abolished Confucianism, burned temples, and banned opium. Millions joined because he promised egalitarian paradise. Qing collapse later inspired religious reinterpretation. After 1900, some Chinese intellectuals lost faith in old gods entirely, turning towards science and secular nationalism. Others blended Buddhism with modern philosophy. Taoist ritual adapted to urban modernity. Christianity spread in treaty ports through missionary schools and hospitals. Myth and religion also shaped Qing memory. After imperial collapse, people told stories of Manchu princes wandering cities disguised as beggars or spirits guarding forbidden palaces. The Forbidden City itself became mythic monument, symbol of lost world. This cultural evolution shows that dynasties fall not only by sword, but by changing imagination. Myth interprets collapse in ways logic cannot. Without these narratives, societies might not find meaning in trauma. Gender patterns in China changed profoundly across the Ming-Qing transition, revealing how imperial collapse transformed personal identity as much as national identity. While military and political events shaped headlines, everyday life was shaped inside homes through marriage, family, work, and gender roles. Understanding gender history during this period helps us humanize dynastic collapse. In the Ming Dynasty, Confucian patriarchy shaped family ideology strongly. Male lineage continuity was primary. Women were taught to serve as daughters, wives, and mothers, but not independent individuals. Marriage was arranged through family negotiation rather than personal choice. Women rarely chose husbands. Men often chose wives based on wealth alliances and social rank. Foot binding, beginning centuries earlier, reached near universality among Han elite women during the Ming. This painful custom shaped female mobility, beauty standards, and marriage opportunity. To elite culture, bound feet symbolized refinement, chastity, and moral discipline. Yet foot binding also reflected structural inequality. Women's value was linked to aesthetics rather than education or independence. However, the Ming also produced remarkable female writers and poets, especially in Jiangnan. Women like Lu Rushi became literary icons, challenging stereotypes. Female education improved slightly in elite circles. Qing gender culture resembled Ming in structure, but differed in detail. The Manchus opposed foot binding among banner women. Manchu women rode horses, practiced archery, and enjoyed greater personal mobility. However, after conquering China, Manchu rulers allowed foot binding to persist among Han women, but forbade it among their own ethnic group. This created dual cultural systems. Han women restricted by binding and domestic ideology. Manchu women freer in physical movement and social expectation. Over time, cultural blending occurred. Some Han families near banner garrisons abandoned binding, while some Manchu women adopted Han fashions. Marriage laws also evolved. The Qing legal code expanded widow protection rights. Under Ming rule, widows were encouraged to commit suicide to honor dead husbands. Stories of chaste widows who starved themselves became moral propaganda. Qing rulers criticized excessive widow suicide. They believed society needed living mothers to raise children. This shift reflects gradual social modernization. Despite patriarchal dominance, women influenced political culture. During early Qing, consorts and empress dowagers shaped court factions. The most powerful example is Empress Dowager Cixi, who ruled empire indirectly for nearly 50 years. Her political maneuvering makes her one of most influential women in world history. She maintained balance between conservatives and reformers, suppressed rebellion response failures, and indirectly determined Qing survival. Her role proves gender did not eliminate political agency, only redirected it. Women also experienced Qing collapse differently from men. In war zones, rape and massacre occurred frequently. During Taiping and Yen uprisings, many women were abducted into rebel camps or banner households. Widowhood increased dramatically after battles. Refugee women sometimes sold goods in markets to survive, challenging gender norms. Later, treaty port cities reshaped gender identity. Christian missionary schools educated girls. Women gained literacy in English and mathematics. Print novels portrayed love marriages as a modern ideal. By late Qing, intellectuals began advocating abolition of foot binding and women's education. The fall of Qing triggered gender revolution. With monarchy gone, cultural reform accelerated. Women petitioned for schooling, careers, and rights. Foot binding campaigns succeeded after 1912. Women writers published essays demanding equality. Thus, gender history reveals collapse not only broke political order, but challenged social structure. Women moved from symbolic cultural icons to active participants in modern transformation. The Ming and Qing collapses redefined Chinese identity in ways that continue to influence modern politics. Identity is never static. Each dynasty reshaped what it meant to belong to the nation. Ethnicity, class, language, and geography all transformed through collapse. The Ming Dynasty emphasized Han identity strongly. Its founders framed the Yuan Mongols as foreign invaders. Ming literature reinforced the idea that Chinese identity was rooted in Han culture, Confucian morality, and agrarian values. When the dynasty collapsed to Manchus, this identity narrative produced resistance, but also trauma. Under the Qing, national identity shifted dramatically. The new empire was multi-ethnic. Manchus, Mongols, Tibetans, Hui Muslims, and Han Chinese all existed under one imperial umbrella. The Qing suppressed Han ethnocentrism because it threatened unity.